He didn't know the woman who collapsed on his doorstep that night would tear apart everything he believed was true. He only knew one thing. If he didn't open that door, she would die. And if he did open it, neither of them might survive until morning. This is the story of an ordinary father, a woman carrying secrets powerful enough to destroy an empire, and one brutal winter night that forced the truth out of the darkness where it had been buried for years. Stay with me until the end, hit like, and drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story has traveled. The temperature outside Mason Carter's house had dropped to 9 degrees Fahrenheit by 8 o'clock that evening, and it was still falling. He stood at the kitchen window with his arms crossed over his chest, watching the snow come down in thick diagonal sheets that the wind kept shredding sideways before they hit the ground. The forecast had called for 6 inches. What was happening outside looked closer to 18, maybe more, and it wasn't slowing down. The Weather Service had upgraded it to a historic blizzard sometime around noon, and by 3 in the afternoon, the County Roads Department had pulled every plow off the highway and told drivers to stay home. Mason had heard that on the battery-powered radio sitting on the kitchen counter. He'd heard it, and then he'd gone back to stacking firewood next to the living room fireplace, because the power had gone out 4 hours earlier and wasn't coming back anytime soon. The house was cold. Not uncomfortable cold, not yet, but the kind of cold that settles into the walls and floors and starts working its way inward, slow and patient, the way cold always does when it has all the time in the world, and you don't. He had one good fire going in the living room. He had about 30 logs left in the stack beside the hearth. He had soup heating in a pot balanced on the iron grate, a flashlight with fresh batteries, and a 6-year-old girl named Lily sleeping on the couch under every blanket he owned. That was the inventory. That was what he had. Mason turned away from the window and walked back to the living room, stepping carefully around the toys scattered across the floor. A plastic dinosaur, a coloring book left face down with a red crayon marking its place, one small sneaker sitting alone in the middle of the hallway for reasons he'd given up trying to understand. He picked up the sneaker out of reflex and set it near the door, then stopped at the couch and looked down at Lily. She was out cold. Her mouth was slightly open. One of her hands had escaped from under the blankets and was curled loosely near her cheek, and her dark hair was fanned out across the pillow in every direction the way it always was when she slept, like she'd been spinning in circles before she went under. She looked peaceful. She looked exactly like her mother. Mason reached down and tucked her hand back under the blankets without waking her. He was 32 years old and he felt about 50. Not in a dramatic way, just in the way that certain kinds of years add weight to you that age alone can't explain. He was lean and broad-shouldered, with hands that were roughed up from construction work and a jaw that needed shaving 3 days ago. He wasn't a man who spent a lot of time looking in mirrors, mostly because he didn't much like what he saw there anymore. Not because of vanity, because of what the reflection reminded him of. 3 years since Sarah died. 3 years since the hospital called him at 6 in the morning and told him to come quickly, and he'd driven there knowing before he even parked the car, knowing in the specific horrible way you know something when your body understands it before your mind catches up. The official cause had been listed as an accident, a hit and run on a rural road 2 miles from the library where she'd worked. Police had investigated. The case had gone cold inside of 6 months. Mason had stopped believing in the word accident about 8 months after that. But believing something and being able to prove it were entirely different problems, and he had a daughter to raise and a mortgage to keep. So he'd set the belief somewhere in the back of his chest, where it sat like a stone he'd learned to carry, and he went on. He went back to the kitchen and stirred the soup. Tomato, from a can, Lily's favorite, or at least the one she complained about the least. He ladled some into a mug and set it on the counter to cool, and leaned against the refrigerator and listened to the storm outside. The wind was something else tonight. It wasn't the kind that rattled windows and moved on. It was the sustained, deliberate kind that pressed against the walls of the house like it was testing them, looking for a weak point. The old farmhouse, his grandfather's place, the only thing left to him after his father died and the estate got sorted, groaned under it. Not alarmingly, just a constant low complaint, the sound of a structure that had been standing for 90 years arguing with a storm that didn't care. Mason had grown up in this house. He knew every creak in its floorboards, every draft that came through the gap under the mudroom door, every radiator that knocked and clanged in weather like this before he remembered the radiators didn't work because the power was gone. He knew this place in the specific bone-deep way you only know somewhere you've come back to after trying hard to leave it. He'd tried to leave it. He'd moved to the city at 22, full of whatever it is young men are full of when they think they're outrunning something. He'd built things there. He'd met Sarah there at a birthday party for a mutual friend, standing in a hallway arguing with someone about a movie she hadn't seen but had strong opinions about anyway. He'd fallen in love with her inside of 3 weeks and married her inside of 2 years and thought for a while that he'd finally managed to build something that would hold. Then the calls started coming. His father's death, cardiac arrest, the doctors said. Sudden and unexplained in a man who'd had a clean bill of health 6 months earlier. Then the estate had problems, financial problems, things that didn't add up, accounts that had been drained in ways no one could cleanly explain. Then Sarah had started digging because Sarah was the kind of person who pulled on threads she wasn't supposed to touch. And then Sarah was dead on a rural road at 5:30 in the morning, and the driver was never found. Mason had brought Lily back to the farmhouse 14 months after the funeral. He'd run out of money for the city apartment, and the construction company he worked for had downsized, and the farmhouse was paid off and sitting empty. He told himself it was temporary. 2 years later, he was still here. He was thinking about none of this specifically and all of it generally, the way you do when a storm pins you inside alone with the dark. When he heard it. At first he thought it was the wind doing something new. The storm had been making strange sounds all evening, pressing through gaps in the eaves, moaning low around the corners of the house, and he'd stopped registering most of it as anything worth attention. But this sound was different. It didn't have the tone of weather. It had the tone of something that weighed something with mass, something that had crossed the porch and come to rest against his front door. Mason set down the ladle. He stood still for a moment, listening. Nothing. Just wind. Then it came again. Not a knock, not exactly. More like a body hitting wood. The soft, heavy, desperate sound of something that had already used up most of what it had and was making one last try. He moved to the front hallway, stepping over the coloring book. He picked up the flashlight from the table near the door and clicked it on, then stood with his hand on the deadbolt for a moment. "Hello?" he called through the door. His voice sounded stupid to him, like something out of a movie. Nothing came back but wind. He unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open. The cold hit him like a wall. That kind of cold that isn't just temperature, it's physical force. It takes your breath and slaps you in the face with it. Snow blew straight in across the threshold and dusted his boots. She was on his porch. She was on her side, half curled against the base of the door, her cheek against the snow-covered wood of the porch floor. She was wearing a coat that had probably cost more than Mason made in a month, but wasn't doing much for her now. It was soaked through, her hair plastered flat and frozen at the ends, her lips an alarming shade of blue-gray. There was blood on the left side of her face, a dark smear that started somewhere in her hairline and tracked down past her temple, already going brown at the edges in the cold. Her eyes were open. That was the thing that stopped him for half a second. Not the blood, not the cold, not the fact that she was here at all, miles from anyone, in the middle of a historic blizzard. Her eyes were open, and they were looking at him, and there was something in them that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite relief. It was something older than both of those things. It was the look of a person who has been calculating odds for a very long time and has finally run out of good options. "Mason," she said. Her voice was barely sound. It was breath shaped into syllables. "Please." He knew her face. He hadn't seen it in 8 years. He'd spent several of those years working hard to make sure he'd never see it again, had deleted the number, had returned the letter unopened, had built a careful interior architecture around the absence of her, the way you frame a wall around a load-bearing beam you've removed. You build around it so you don't have to look at where the original structure used to be. Evelyn Sterling. The name arrived in his chest like a fist. She was 30 years old now. 8 years ago, she'd been 22, the same as him, the daughter of the man who'd employed his father, the girl who'd shown up at construction sites in her father's wake like she was conducting her own private audit of the world. He'd known her for 3 years before anything happened between them, and for 1 year after that, And then she'd ended it with a silence so complete it felt like erasure. No fight, no scene, no explanation that made any real sense. She'd simply stopped, and he'd eventually stopped waiting, and then his father had died, and then Sarah had died, and the world had collapsed down into the small, salvageable thing it was now. And here she was, on his porch, bleeding in a blizzard. What? He stopped. The question was too large for the doorway. Can you move? She tried. He could see her try. Her hand pressed against the porch floor and her shoulder shifted, and then whatever was driving that effort gave out and she dropped back with a sound that wasn't quite a gasp. Okay, Mason said. Okay, don't. He bent down and got his arms under her, one behind her shoulders, one under her knees. And the weight of her was less than he expected, either because she was smaller than he remembered or because the cold had done something to his sense of things. He got her through the door and kicked it shut behind him and carried her down the hallway into the living room, where the fire was doing its steady orange work against the dark. He laid her on the rug in front of the hearth. She was shaking, not the dramatic shaking of movies, small, rapid, almost mechanical tremors, the kind that mean the body has moved past panic and into the biochemical work of trying to survive. Her lips were still that bad color. Her fingers, when he peeled off the soaked gloves, were white at the tips. Lily, he said, not raising his voice, just saying it clearly into the dark room. From the couch, a small stirring, a murmur. I need you to stay right there, Bug. Don't come over here yet, okay? Just stay under the blankets. Daddy? Lily's voice, half asleep, curious rather than afraid. I'm right here. Just stay put. He got up and went to the bedroom closet and pulled down the emergency kit from the top shelf. The one he'd put together after Sarah died, when the part of him that dealt in pragmatic preparations had needed something to do. Thermal blanket, medical tape, gauze, the small first aid kit he'd bought at the hardware store 3 winters ago and hoped he'd never use. He grabbed 2 more wool blankets off the bed while he was at it. When he came back, Evelyn had managed to push herself to a sitting position. She was leaning against the couch, Lily's couch, where Lily was still lying in a small lump of blankets, and she had one hand pressed to the wound on her head. Her eyes tracked him when he came back in. How bad? He asked, nodding at her head. It's not deep, she said. Her voice was slightly stronger now, just slightly. I don't think. It bled a lot. Head wounds do. He crouched in front of her and peeled her hand away and aimed the flashlight at the cut. It was maybe 2 inches long above the left temple, the edges ragged rather than clean. He'd seen worse on job sites. This didn't happen falling down. No, she said. What did happen? She looked at him. The firelight caught the left side of her face and made the dried blood look like a shadow. Her eyes were the same as he remembered. That specific shade of gray-green that changed depending on the light, that he'd spent a long time not thinking about, and had managed, mostly, to succeed. Can we... She stopped, swallowed. Can I get warm first? I'll tell you everything, I promise, but can I just... Yeah, Mason said. He didn't know why he said it that easily. Some reflex, maybe. Some old habit of taking her at her word. Yeah, get warm first. He wrapped the thermal blanket around her shoulders and draped the wool blankets over that, and got the first aid kit open and cleaned the cut with antiseptic and taped a gauze pad over it while she sat perfectly still and let him work. She made no sound when the antiseptic hit. He noticed that. Daddy, Lily's voice from above them, from the couch. Who is that lady? Mason looked up. Lily had wriggled to the edge of the couch and was peering down at Evelyn with the focused, unembarrassed curiosity of a 6-year-old who had not yet learned that staring was rude. Her name is Evelyn, Mason said. She got caught in the storm. Lily considered this. Her face is hurt. I know, I'm fixing it. Does she want some soup? I didn't eat mine yet. Mason glanced at Evelyn. Something passed across Evelyn's face. A small, involuntary thing, there and gone. Not sentimentality exactly. Something more complicated and less nameable. That would be really kind, Evelyn said to Lily. Her voice, aimed at the child, had gone softer. Thank you. Lily nodded, satisfied, and disappeared back under her blankets. Mason finished taping the gauze and sat back on his heels and looked at Evelyn Sterling properly for the first time in 8 years. She was still beautiful in the specific way she'd always been. Not the kind that announces itself, but the kind that's structural, built into the bones. Her face was thinner than he remembered. There were shadows under her eyes that hadn't been there before, or at least not that he'd seen. Her hands, now that they'd started to warm, were trembling in a way she was clearly trying to control and mostly failing to. She also had bruising on her right wrist that was fresh and already going purple, and when she'd shifted to let him work on her head, he'd seen her move her left side carefully, protectively, in the way people move when something beneath the surface is broken or close to it. "Those are not from falling in the snow," Mason said. "No." "Someone hit you." She didn't answer right away. She looked at the fire. Something in her jaw tightened and released. "Several someones," she said quietly. The wind hit the house from the north and the windows rattled in their frames. Somewhere upstairs, a shutter that Mason kept meaning to fix banged against the siding once, twice, then caught. "Evelyn." He said her name the way you say a word you haven't used in a long time, carefully, feeling the shape of it. "Who knows you're here?" She looked at him then, full on, direct, the way she used to look at him when she was about to say something she'd already rehearsed and discarded and come back to. "That's the problem," she said. Mason stood up. He walked to the window and looked out at the dark and the snow, at the driveway that had disappeared under a foot of white, at the road beyond it that had disappeared even longer ago. Nothing moved out there. The world was white and black and howling. He came back to the fireplace and sat in the armchair across from her, elbows on his knees. "Start talking," he said. "And don't." He stopped himself. Started again. "I've got a 6-year-old in this room and no way out of here until that storm breaks, so whatever you're going to say it straight." Evelyn pulled the blankets tighter around her shoulders. She looked at the fire for a moment, then she looked at him. "I didn't want to come here," she said. "I want you to know that. Not because—" She stopped. "It's complicated, but I didn't have anywhere else. I ran out of options 3 miles back and my car went into a ditch off Route 9, and this was the only house with smoke coming out of the chimney." "Okay. And I want you to know something else." She held his gaze. Her voice was steady now, or steadier. The warmth was doing something, and whatever was driving her to speak seemed to be doing the rest. "Everything you're about to hear is going to make you angry. You have every right to be angry, but I need you to listen to all of it before you—" "Evelyn." "What?" "I said start talking, not start warning me about talking." She almost smiled. It was barely anything, but a ghost of a thing at the corner of her mouth, and it disappeared immediately, like she'd caught herself doing it. "Fair enough," she said. Outside, the blizzard pressed harder against the house. The fire cracked and shifted. Lily had fallen back asleep on the couch, her breathing slow and even beneath the pile of blankets, her small chest rising and falling with the reliability of something that doesn't yet know enough to be afraid. Mason Carter sat in his dead grandfather's armchair in his dead grandfather's house, listening to the storm, watching the woman he'd spent 8 years not thinking about get ready to tell him something that was going to take apart whatever was left of the world he'd built from the wreckage of the last one. He was not ready. He didn't say that. He waited. "Your father didn't die of a heart attack," Evelyn said. The fire cracked. "I know," Mason said. She stopped. Whatever she'd been ready to say next, the scaffolding she'd built around that sentence, the explanation, the softening, he'd knocked it over with 2 words, and he watched her recalibrate in real time. "You know," she repeated. "I've known for about 2 years. I don't know the whole thing. I know the official story doesn't hold. I know the financial records from his estate don't add up, and that 2 of the accountants who flagged the discrepancies stopped working in their field inside of a year. I know that the driver who killed Sarah was never identified despite the intersection having a traffic camera that, according to the police report, wasn't functioning that morning." He said all of this very quietly, very evenly. The way you say things you've said to yourself so many times they've worn smooth. "I know I can't prove any of it. I know I don't know who's behind it. I know I've been sitting in this house for 2 years waiting for something to break open." Evelyn was very still. You've been investigating, she said. Not officially. I don't have those resources, but I've been keeping track. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, I have the resources. I have the proof. And I've been keeping track a lot longer than you have. Something cold moved through Mason's chest that had nothing to do with the temperature. How long? He said. Since before your father died, she said. I need you to understand what I'm telling you. I knew what was coming. I didn't know how fast or how far, and I made choices trying to slow it down, trying to protect you She stopped, pressed her lips together. That I'm not sure were right, but I made them. The fire, the wind, Lily's breathing. You knew, Mason said slowly, before my father died. Yes. And you didn't I tried. Her voice cracked just slightly, then held. I tried in the ways I had available to me. Mason, I was 23 years old and I had just discovered that my father's company, the company I'd grown up inside of, the company I was being groomed to take over, had been running a secondary operation for 15 years that I hadn't known existed. And the people running it were not the kind of people you walk into a police station and report, because those people had been buying police stations for a decade. Mason said nothing. When I ended things with you, she said, and her voice changed again, got quieter in a different way. It was not because I wanted to. I ended it because you were a target. You were connected to me, and I was connected to your father's financial records, and the people I was dealing with had already demonstrated that they were willing to remove anyone who got close to the truth. Removing you from my orbit was the only thing I could think of that might keep you off their list. The room was very quiet except for the wind. Mason stood up. He walked to the kitchen and stood at the sink and looked at nothing for a while. He put both hands on the cold edge of the counter and breathed. When he came back, she hadn't moved. Sarah, he said. The word cost something to say. Evelyn's face changed. It didn't crumple. She wasn't that kind, and he'd always known that about her. But something in it gave way, some carefully maintained structural thing, and what was underneath it was not what he'd expected. It wasn't guilt exactly. It was something rawer and older and heavier than guilt. She found something, Evelyn said. I don't know how. She was working at the library and apparently she'd been using the research databases there, pulling financial records, public filings, SEC documents, things that are technically available, but only if you know what you're looking for. She somehow put together a partial picture of what the organization was doing, and she reached out. Evelyn paused. She reached out to my office. She sent a letter to my legal department flagging the discrepancies. She didn't know what she'd found. She didn't know she'd just announced herself to the people who monitored all incoming correspondence for exactly that kind of flag. Mason sat down. He had to. His legs didn't particularly feel like continuing the conversation. She didn't know, he said. No. And they moved fast. I didn't know until after. Evelyn's voice was very careful now, each word placed with precision, like she was crossing ice. I was in London when it happened. When I got back and found out, when I understood what had happened, I nearly... She stopped, started again. It changed what I was doing. It changed how fast I was moving. I stopped trying to be careful and I started trying to be done. Mason was looking at the floor. There was a crayon mark on the hardwood near his left boot, red in a looping spiral, that Lily had made 3 weeks ago and that he kept meaning to clean off. He looked at it. 4 more years, he said. She died 4 years ago. You've had 4 years. Building a case that can't be dismantled, Evelyn said, against people who own judges and have eliminated witnesses and have enough money and infrastructure to turn a criminal investigation into a missing persons case for the investigators. Yes, 4 years, I'm sorry. I know how that sounds. Sounds like 4 years, Mason said. Yes. He looked up at her. Why tonight? He said. Why are you here tonight, in this specific blizzard, on my specific porch? She shifted, and again he saw her move her left side with that careful economy. Because 3 days ago, someone inside my organization told them I had the complete file, she said. The full evidence package. Documents, recordings, financial records, testimony. They've been looking for me since Monday. Tonight they found my car. Who's they? The operational arm. The people who handle the physical side of things, not executives. Those men are very comfortable in very nice offices, and they have other people do the parts that leave marks. Her voice had gone flat. I got out of the car before they reached it. I ran. I've been running for about 3 hours. Through this storm. Through this storm. Mason looked at her. The bruised wrist, the head wound, the blankets piled around her against a cold she'd earned by running through a blizzard in the dark. And something shifted in him that he didn't fully want to name. "Where is it?" he said. "The file. Encrypted. Multiple locations. If anything happens to me, it automatically transmits to 4 separate federal contacts I've been developing for 2 years, but..." She stopped. "But if they get to you before the file transmits, they'd rather have you confirm the decryption keys, or at least make sure you're not around to testify." "Yes," she said simply. Mason got up and went back to the window and looked at the dark for the second time that night. The snow was still coming. The driveway was gone. The road was gone. The night was a solid white-black thing pressing against the glass. "My phone has no signal," he said. "Mine's dead," she said. "I lost it somewhere in the woods." He turned away from the window. "Battery radio," he said. I've got a battery radio. Emergency band, I can try to..." "Mason!" Her voice stopped him. "They're not far behind me. The storm slows them down, but it slowed me down too. We have maybe..." She glanced toward the frost-edged window. "Maybe until morning." "The federal contacts," he said. "The ones the file transmits to. They know something is wrong. I missed 2 check-ins. They'll be moving already, but in this weather, even emergency..." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. Mason stood in the middle of his grandfather's living room, in the house where he'd grown up, with his sleeping daughter on the couch, and the fire burning low, and a woman from his past bleeding quietly on his floor, in the middle of the worst storm in 30 years, and he did the math. It didn't add up to anything he liked. He went to the fireplace and put 2 more logs on, and then he went to the kitchen and ladled soup into a second mug and brought it back and set it on the floor beside Evelyn without a word. She wrapped both hands around it and looked at him over the rim. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me," he said. Tell me everything. Every name, every detail, everything you know. If we're sitting here until morning with no phone and no way out, I'm not going to sit here ignorant." Something moved in her face. The complicated thing again, that wasn't quite guilt and wasn't quite relief. It was recognition, maybe. The particular recognition of seeing someone the way you knew them before everything went wrong. "Okay," she said. "And Evelyn?" "Yeah." "If any part of what you're about to tell me turns out to be something other than the truth..." He stopped. He didn't threaten her. He didn't know what the end of the sentence was, and he wasn't the kind of man who made threats he couldn't follow through on. "Just don't," he said. "I won't," she said. "I'm done with that." The fire burned. The storm pressed. Lily slept on the couch with her hand curled under her cheek, breathing in and out with the steady patience of children who don't yet know what waits on the other side of the night. And Evelyn Sterling began to talk. She started with her father. Not because it was the beginning. She was clear about that, said it plainly, that the beginning predated her father by at least a decade. But because her father was where her own understanding of it started, and she figured that was the most honest place to enter the story. Richard Sterling had built Sterling Capital Group from a regional investment firm into something considerably larger and more complicated over the course of 20 years. And by the time Evelyn was old enough to understand what her father actually did for a living, Sterling Capital had its hands in infrastructure contracts, municipal bonds, private equity, and a half dozen other things that required lawyers and accountants and people who were very good at making one number look like a different number on paper. She'd grown up around it. She'd grown up around the dinners and the handshakes and the men in good suits who came and went from her father's study with briefcases and quiet voices in the specific manner of people who consider their time worth more than yours. She'd thought it was normal because it was the only normal she'd known, and she'd gone to the right schools and studied finance and come back to work in her father's company at 21 because that had always been the plan, hers and his. And for the first year, she told Mason, I thought everything was exactly what it looked like. A big company with a lot of moving parts and a certain amount of, I don't know, gray area that I assumed was just how business at that level worked. I was 21. I didn't know enough to know what I didn't know. She paused and looked down at the mug in her hands. The soup had cooled and she was drinking it anyway. Small, slow sips, as though she wasn't sure her stomach was ready to be trusted yet. "What changed?" Mason asked. He was in the armchair. He'd refilled his own coffee, instant, from a pot of water he'd heated on the grate. Not good, but hot. And he was holding it in both hands and watching her with the focused stillness of a man who has learned that sometimes you get more information by not moving. "I found a second set of books," Evelyn said, "not by accident and not right away. I was 22. I'd been given access to the internal audit system as part of my training. My father wanted me to understand every part of the business. That was always his thing. Know the whole machine, not just the parts that look good. And I was going through archived accounts one evening because I was trying to understand a discrepancy in a municipal contract that didn't line up with what the public filing said, and I found an account that wasn't in any of the documentation I'd been given. It had its own ledger, its own transfer history, and it had been running for 11 years. She said the name of the account the way you say something you've been careful not to say for a long time. Meridian Holdings. That was the name on the account. Meridian Holdings, registered in the Cayman Islands, and it had received wire transfers from 17 different Sterling Capital subsidiaries over 11 years totaling. She stopped. It doesn't matter the exact figure. It was enough. Enough to mean this wasn't creative accounting. This was structural. This was built in from the beginning. Mason was quiet. "I should have gone to someone right then," Evelyn said. "I know that. I've thought about it more times than I can count. But I was 22 and I was standing in my father's company looking at something that would destroy my father's company. And I made a mistake. I didn't go to anyone. I made a copy of what I'd found and I closed the account file. And I went home and I spent 3 days not sleeping and trying to figure out what to do. And then? And then I made a second mistake." She set down the mug. She looked at him directly. "I confronted my father." Mason said nothing, but something shifted in his face. "I know," she said. "I know. I was 22 and I was stupid, and I trusted him in the specific blind way you trust the person who taught you everything, even when what's in front of you says you probably shouldn't." She rubbed the back of her hand across her mouth. "He didn't deny it. That was the part I wasn't ready for. He didn't deny any of it. He told me to sit down, and he explained it to me the way you explain something to a child who has found something they don't understand. Patiently, carefully, like it was complicated, but not wrong." "What did he say?" "He said that Sterling Capital had certain partnerships that operated outside normal regulatory frameworks, and that those partnerships were what made everything else possible. He said it had been going on since before I was born, and that the people involved were not people you walked away from. He said that as long as I didn't interfere with it, my part of the business, the legitimate part, the public-facing investments, the work I'd actually been brought in to do, would never be touched. He said the wall between those two worlds was solid, and I should stay on my side of it." She paused. "And then he said something that I think about every single day," she said. "He looked at me across his desk and he said, 'The people in that account are not patient with complications, Evelyn. Do you understand what I'm telling you?' And he was looking at me the way, not threatening me. That was the worst part. He was scared. My father, who I had never seen afraid of anything in my life, was scared of these people, and he was warning me." The fire shifted and settled. Outside, the storm was in one of its quieter phases. The wind still high but not actively shrieking, the snow falling straight down instead of sideways. It made the room feel more enclosed somehow, more complete. "So you stayed quiet," Mason said. "For about 6 months, yes. And then your father started finding things." Mason set down his coffee cup on the side table. He did it slowly, carefully, the way you handle something when your hands aren't completely steady. "Tell me," he said. His voice was even. She noticed how even it was. She'd noticed that about him in the old days, the way he went quieter, not louder, when something hit him. "Thomas Carter was one of the best forensic accountants your father's company ever employed," Evelyn said, "which was why Sterling Capital hired his firm in the first place, 8 years before any of this, to handle due diligence on a series of infrastructure acquisitions. He was good at seeing what wasn't there, the absence of documentation, the gap where something should be. And over the course of about 18 months, working on completely unrelated projects, he'd started assembling a picture. Not the whole thing, but enough of it to be dangerous. He never told me, Mason said. He wouldn't have, not until he was sure. From what I knew of him, that's exactly what he would have done. A beat. He was building a file, similar to what I was doing actually, from the other direction. I knew about the internal structure. He was mapping it from the outside in. If the two files had ever combined, she didn't finish the thought. She didn't need to. They found out he was building it, Mason said. Yes. I don't know who flagged it. Someone inside the audit process. Someone who recognized what Thomas was looking for before he found the last pieces. The decision was made quickly. Too quickly for me to do anything. Her voice flattened. I found out 2 days after he died. I found out because the same internal channel that reported Thomas's investigation to the organization also reported back that it had been handled. That's the word they used. Handled. Mason was absolutely still. I went to my father, Evelyn said. I went to him the same night I found out. I told him I knew what had happened to Thomas Carter, and I told him I was done. I was going to the FBI. I was burning the whole thing down. And my father... She stopped. When she continued, her voice was different, heavier in a specific way. My father looked at me and said he couldn't protect me if I did that it wasn't in his power anymore, that these people didn't operate on warnings, and that if I moved against them, I would be handled the same way. The words sat in the room. So I did something I'm not proud of, she said. I backed down. I told him I understood. And then I went home and I spent 2 weeks planning the most careful thing I'd ever done in my life. Because I was not going to go to the FBI with nothing and get myself killed 6 hours later. And I was not going to stay quiet, and the only path between those two things was building something so complete and so iron-tight that when it broke, it would break all at once, and there would be nothing left to fight back with. And you pushed me away, Mason said. His voice was still flat, still careful. Yes. While I was grieving my father. Yes. She held his gaze. She didn't look away from it. You were the clearest connection between me and Thomas. If they were watching me, and by that point I had to assume they were, then you being in my life was a liability for you. The calculation was not complicated. The hardest part of it had nothing to do with calculation. Silence. You could have told me, Mason said. You could have said something. And what would you have done? He opened his mouth, closed it. You would have gone straight at them, she said. Not accusing, just stating. Because that's what you do, Mason. I knew that about you then. And looking at you right now, I can see it hasn't changed. You would have gone at them with whatever you had, which at that point was nothing, and you would have ended up like your father. You didn't know that. I was pretty sure. He stood up and walked to the fireplace and stood with his back to her, one hand on the mantel, looking at the fire. She let him stand there. She'd learned, in the years she'd known him, that he needed the movement. Needed to physically reposition when something was hitting him hard. Needed to not be looked at for a minute. She'd always understood that about him without his ever having to say it. She looked at the sleeping shape of Lily on the couch instead. The little girl was breathing in long, slow pulls, deep under the blankets, entirely absent from everything being said in this room. She had Mason's jaw. Evelyn could see that even in the firelight, that same line of it, stubborn looking at rest. She wondered briefly who she had the rest from. Sarah, Mason said without turning around. You said she reached out to your legal department. Yes. How long after you pushed me away? About 3 years. So, 3 years after you supposedly removed me from the picture. Yes. He turned around then. So the thing you did to protect us didn't protect us. The words landed exactly as hard as they were meant to, and Evelyn took them without flinching because she had spent 4 years taking that particular weight from herself every night, and she'd earned the right to absorb it from him now without defending herself. No, she said, it didn't, because I hadn't accounted for the fact that Sarah would start looking on her own, for her own reasons, and that she'd be good enough at it to get close. She paused. Do you know why she started looking? Mason was quiet for a moment. She never talked about it directly, but she'd been asking me questions about my father, about his work, about who he'd been working with before he died. I thought she was just trying to understand, trying to fill in the picture for herself. She wasn't just filling in a picture, she'd found something specific. Evelyn reached into the inside pocket of her ruined coat. She'd never taken it off, and he noticed now that she'd kept it on even next to the fire, which might mean the cold hadn't left her yet, or might mean there was something in that coat she didn't want to be far from. She came out with a small waterproof case, roughly the size of a large wallet, sealed with a zipper. She held it, but didn't open it yet. 2 months before she died, Sarah was cataloging a donation of financial history documents to the library, an estate donation. Someone's dead relative who'd worked in municipal finance, boxes of old papers. And in those boxes was a series of internal memos from the early years of Meridian Holdings, before they'd gotten good at keeping that side of things clean. Hand-typed, 15 years old, names and transfer amounts and routing information that laid out exactly how money from 2 city infrastructure contracts had been redirected through a shell company into Meridian. She set the case on the floor between them. She recognized the Sterling name from your father's old files. That was the thread she pulled. She didn't know what she'd found. She thought she'd found evidence of a specific contract fraud. She had no idea she'd found the corner of something that went 30 times deeper. Mason looked at the waterproof case. Is that a copy of her original documentation? Yes. Evelyn's voice went quieter. I found it through my own channels 8 months after she died. I've had it for 3 years. I want you to understand that I've been building this case around her, around what she started, since the moment I found out what she'd found. Something went through Mason's face that he shut down almost immediately, but not quite fast enough. It lasted maybe half a second, a raw, unguarded thing, and then it was gone, and he was back behind whatever he'd built to function through the last 4 years. He walked to the couch and sat on the edge of it, near Lily's feet, and looked at the floor. She would have wanted it to matter, he said. It wasn't really directed at Evelyn. It was more like something he was saying out loud to himself, or to the room. It's going to matter, Evelyn said. You don't know that. No, she admitted. But it's the only direction I have to go. The storm outside did something then. A shift in pitch, the wind finding a new note, lower and more sustained, that pressed against the north wall of the house like it had decided to commit. The candle Mason had set on the mantel, pillar candle, half burned, a leftover from some ordinary evening that felt very far away now, guttered and recovered. Lily stirred on the couch but didn't wake. The people who followed you tonight, Mason said. How many? I saw 3. In the car. There may be more. They typically send 1 vehicle for containment and have a second on standby if the first runs into trouble. Armed. It wasn't a question, but she answered it. Yes. And they know you came in this direction. They know my car went off Route 9, roughly 3 miles north of here. They know I ran. In this storm, tracking footprints isn't possible, but there are only so many houses this far out, and this is the only one with a visible fire. Mason absorbed this. The radio, he said. He got up and went to the kitchen and came back with the battery radio. He spent a minute working through the frequencies until he found the emergency services band and held the radio up and listened. There was a lot of static. Through it, in fragments, he could make out the tail end of what sounded like road closure updates. Something about emergency services being suspended on county roads until the storm broke. They're not coming out for anything short of a cardiac event, he said. He set the radio on the side table. And maybe not even then, in this. I know. So we're here until morning. Yes. He sat back in the armchair. He looked at her with the kind of look that doesn't have a simple name. It was too many things at once, too layered, and she could see him working through the layers in real time. The anger and the grief and the thing underneath both of those that neither of them was going to name right now. The federal contacts, he said, the ones the file transmits to. Tell me about them. She told him. 2 FBI agents she'd been cultivating a relationship with over 2 years through an intermediary. A lawyer she trusted, the only person outside the situation who knew the full scope of it. The transmission was set up to trigger automatically if she missed 3 consecutive check-ins. She'd missed 2. If she didn't check in by 6 in the morning, the third missed signal would send the file. 6 in the morning, Mason said. He looked at the clock on the wall. Battery powered, still running. It was 11:47. That's 6 hours. Approximately. So if we can stay quiet until 6, the agents have my location data from the last check-in. They'll know roughly where I am. Once the file transmits, they'll have cause to move with full authority. They can bring a tactical team regardless of road conditions. They have the equipment for it. 6 hours, Mason said again. 6 hours, Evelyn confirmed. He was quiet for a moment. Then, where's the pain? Your left side. She looked at him. You've been protecting it since you came in. Ribs? I think 2 of them are cracked, she said. Maybe 3. It's hard to tell. Everything in that quadrant hurts equally. From tonight? From 2 nights ago, actually. I miscalculated a situation and someone made a point. She said it flatly, clinical about it, the way people get when they've had time to absorb the damage and the pain has settled into something manageable. It's not my only injury, but it's the most inconvenient one. Mason got up without saying anything and went to the emergency kit and came back with an ace bandage. He held it out. She took it. Thank you. Can you manage it yourself or? I've got it. He turned away to give her privacy while she worked, and he added more wood to the fire. And when he turned back, she had the coat on again, and her expression was the same as before. There's something else, she said. Something I haven't told you yet. He sat down. The organization has a name. Internally, they've always called it the Concord Group. It's not registered anywhere. See, it's not a legal entity. It doesn't appear on any filing. It's a private network of 11 individuals who collectively control enough capital and political leverage to function essentially outside normal accountability. She said this with a kind of grim precision, the way you talk about something you've been studying for years. 3 of them are executives who were at Sterling Capital at the founding. 2 are sitting members of 2 different state regulatory boards. 1 is a federal prosecutor. Mason was very still. A federal prosecutor, he said. Which is why I haven't gone directly to the DOJ, she said. Why the 2 FBI agents I've been working with have been vetted through a specific internal affairs channel that operates independently of the main prosecutorial pipeline. Because the question of who you can trust has not been a simple one. Who's the prosecutor? She told him the name. He recognized it. He didn't say so immediately. He sat with it for a moment, running it against things he knew, against the timeline. The investigation into Sarah's death. The detective who'd called him to say the case was being deprioritized. The specific language in the closing report that, when he'd read it 2 years later with fresh eyes, had struck him as language designed to close a door rather than note an absence of evidence. That's who shut down the investigation, he said. Yes, not directly, through channels, but yes. Mason picked up his coffee cup. It was cold. He drank it anyway because his hands needed something to do. You've been doing this for 8 years, he said. Alone. Mostly. That lawyer you mentioned. Daniel Reeves. He's the only other person who knows the full picture. He's also in a secure location right now. I hope. A pause. He's the one who will initiate the transmission protocol if I miss the 3rd check-in. You hope, Mason repeated. The last communication I had from him was 31 hours ago. He was fine then. She held his gaze steady. I don't know about now. This landed between them and sat there. Outside, the storm pressed and moaned. The fire burned lower and Mason got up to feed it without being asked. The automatic hospitality of someone who grew up in a house where keeping things running was just what you did, not something you thought about. He was at the fireplace, crouching to settle a new log, when Lily spoke. Daddy? Not sleepy this time. Clear. Hey, Bug. He stayed crouched, turning to look at her. She was sitting up, hair wrecked from sleep, eyes alert in the specific way children's eyes are alert at odd hours. Fully awake. No transition zone. Everything's okay. Go back to sleep. Lily looked at him. Then she looked at Evelyn. Are you still cold? She asked Evelyn. Direct? Practical. Evelyn blinked. A little less now. Thank you. You can have my other blanket. Lily was already pulling one of the blankets off herself, the thin fleece one with the cartoon foxes on it. I have too many. Lily, Mason started. I have 4 blankets, Daddy. That's too many. She held the fleece one out toward Evelyn with the specific authority of a 6-year-old who has made a decision and is not accepting further input. Evelyn took it. She unfolded it carefully and draped it over her legs. Thank you, Lily, she said. That's very kind. You're welcome. Lily settled back into her remaining 3 blankets and looked at Mason. Is there more soup? Yeah, give me a minute. Okay. She lay back down. In approximately 90 seconds, she was asleep again. Mason stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at his daughter for a moment with an expression that was not readable from the outside, and then he went and got the soup. When he came back, Evelyn was watching the fire. The cartoon fox blanket was around her legs and the emergency thermal sheet was still around her shoulders, and she looked, in the firelight, like something put together from parts that had been through a significant amount. She looked up when he came in. She's extraordinary, she said. Yeah. He set Lily's mug of soup on the end table within her reach and sat back down. She is. A silence. Not comfortable exactly, but not hostile. The kind of silence that forms between people who have been talking very hard and need a moment to let it settle. What was she like? Evelyn asked, and then, before he could answer, or maybe seeing something in his face, Sorry, you don't have to. It's okay. He thought about it for a moment. She was stubborn, in a quiet way. Not a fighter on the outside, but you could not get her to let go of something once she'd decided it mattered. She was the kind of person who would notice something wrong in a 15-year-old document in a box of estate papers and not be able to put it down. He looked at the fire. It's the thing I loved most about her, and it's the thing that... He stopped. Evelyn didn't fill the silence. She understood, apparently, that it didn't need filling. I want them to answer for it, Mason said. All of them. Every name in that file. They will. You sound sure. I've spent 8 years making sure. She said it without drama. Just information. He looked at her across the firelight, across the gap of 8 years and everything that had happened in them, and he did not forgive her. That wasn't what this was. Not yet, maybe not for a long time. But he understood for the first time the shape of what she'd been doing, and understanding it was its own complicated thing that he was going to have to figure out where to put. The clock on the wall said 12:18. 5 hours and 42 minutes to 6 a.m. We should stay awake, Mason said. Yes. You should eat something else if you can. I'm okay. You ran 3 miles in a historic blizzard with cracked ribs and a head wound. I know what I did, Mason. Then eat something else. She looked at him for a moment, and then she almost did the thing with the corner of her mouth again, and this time she didn't catch it quite fast enough. Do you have anything other than tomato soup? She said. I've got crackers and peanut butter and half a box of granola bars. That sounds terrible. It is, he said. But it's hot in here and you're still alive, so... She held his gaze. Yeah, she said quietly. I am. He got up and went to the kitchen cabinet. The clock ticked on the wall. The fire burned. The storm worked against the house from all directions, patient and enormous, indifferent to everything inside it. And outside, somewhere in the white dark between the trees and the buried road, the night held whatever was moving through it, and the only question that mattered now was whether it would move faster than the hours. The granola bars were stale. Evelyn ate one anyway without complaining about it, and Mason ate one standing up in the kitchen doorway, and for about 20 minutes they didn't talk. Not because there was nothing left to say, but because there was too much, and the night had reached that particular hour, somewhere past midnight, not yet close enough to morning to feel like progress, when conversation gets heavy in a different way than it does earlier in the evening. Mason used the quiet to think. He went through the house methodically in his head, the way he went through job sites before starting work. Inventory first, then assessment, then plan. What he had, a 2-story farmhouse, fieldstone foundation, the crawl space underneath accessible through a hatch in the kitchen floor that his grandfather had built for root vegetable storage, and that Mason had never done anything with except throw a rug over. 4 exterior doors, front, back mudroom, the cellar bulkhead on the north side, and the storm door off the kitchen that led to the attached garage. The garage had his truck in it, useless in the current snow depth without chains he didn't have, but the garage itself was solid, insulated, a secondary structure if it came to that. Windows, 12 on the ground floor, 6 on the second. The second floor was currently unheated and about 45 degrees, cold enough to be uncomfortable but not dangerous for a short period. He thought about the crawl space. He thought about it for a while. Then he went and moved the rug in the kitchen and looked at the hatch. It was about 2 feet by 3, with an iron ring pull, and it opened onto a space that ran the full footprint of the house. Low clearance, maybe 4 feet of headroom at the center beam, rough fieldstone walls, a dirt floor that would be cold as a meat locker, but was dry. His grandfather had used it for potatoes and root vegetables, and the occasional jar of something that needed to stay cold. Mason had been down there once since coming back to the house, to check the foundation drainage after a wet spring, and the memory of it was unpleasant but manageable. It was dark and low and cold, and it was also invisible from the exterior and accessible from exactly one point inside the house. He closed the hatch and put the rug back. He went back to the living room. Evelyn was sitting the same way she'd been sitting, but her eyes were sharper now, watching him the way she watched things when her mind was working through something. She'd always done that. Gone very still when she was thinking hard. Conserved motion the way someone conserves battery life when they're not sure how long they need to last. "You're planning something," she said. "I'm thinking about architecture," he said. He sat down. "Tell me about the people following you, not how many. Tell me how they operate. What's their method when they reach a location?" She considered this. They're not improvising. Whoever they send, they follow a protocol. They identify all exit points first. They establish a perimeter before they make contact. They're not going to come through the front door guns blazing. They'll be quiet about it, or as quiet as the situation allows. They'd rather take me out of here without a scene than create a situation that requires explaining. "So they'll knock," Mason said. "Probably. And if no one answers, then they'll make entry, but not loud, not a forced breach. They have the tools to do it quietly." "How long does establishing a perimeter take in these conditions?" She thought. "Longer than normal. Moving through 3 feet of snow in the dark, they'd need 10, maybe 15 minutes to get people properly positioned. They're not going to rush it and risk one of them going down in a ditch." Mason nodded slowly. "What are you thinking?" Evelyn asked. "I'm thinking about how this house is built," he said. "And I'm thinking that if they come before 6, I want you and Lily somewhere they're not going to find you in the first few minutes." The understanding of what he was saying moved across her face. "The crawl space. You saw me move the rug. I see most things. Can you manage the hatch? Your ribs. I can manage it." He looked at her. He was doing the specific math of a man who has calculated risks his whole life in physical terms. Weights and loads and structural tolerances, what a thing can take and what it can't, and was now applying it to a completely different problem. "If they come before 6, I'll get you 2 under. You keep Lily calm. I need her not to make noise." "She'll follow your lead," Evelyn said, "if you tell her it's a game or an exercise." "I'm not going to lie to her," Mason said. "She's 6, not 2. She'll know something's wrong. I'll tell her it's important to be very quiet and still, and she'll do it because she trusts me." He paused. "She's good in a crisis. She gets that from her mother." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "And what will you be doing," she said, "while we're under the house?" He didn't answer immediately. He got up and went to the mudroom off the back hallway and opened the utility closet. He stood looking at what was in it for a moment. Work boots, a rain slicker, an old canvas jacket, 2 boxes of nails, a level, a cordless drill with a dead battery, and on the bottom shelf, in the canvas bag he kept his hand tools in, a 22-ounce framing hammer with a hickory handle that he'd bought 12 years ago and used every working day since. He picked it up and felt the weight of it in his hand and set it on the shelf at eye level and went back to the living room. "Mason," Evelyn's voice was careful, "you can't fight them with, 'I know what I can and can't do,'" he said. "I'm not planning to fight them. I'm planning to slow them down. There's a difference. That's not, if they get to you before 6, none of the rest of it matters. The file doesn't transmit. The FBI doesn't come. Everything you've spent 8 years building goes nowhere, and my daughter is in this house." He sat down and looked at her. "So I'm going to slow them down, however long it takes." She held his gaze. She didn't say what he could see her thinking, that the odds of one man with a hammer slowing down 2 or 3 armed professionals long enough to matter were not good. She didn't say it because he already knew it, and saying it out loud wouldn't change the math, and she understood, he thought, that he wasn't asking for her assessment of the odds. "The battery radio," she said instead. "Emergency band? If conditions break even slightly, there may be—" "I've had it on low since midnight." He nodded toward the counter. "Nothing useful yet. Still shutting down county response. But I'll keep checking." She nodded. They went back to not talking for a while, but the silence was different now. It had a shape to it, a specific weight, the weight of 2 people sitting with a plan that neither of them fully likes, but both of them know is the only one available. Around 1:30, Lily woke again. This time she woke the way she sometimes did in the night, disoriented, reaching for something that wasn't there, and made a small sound that brought Mason off his chair before she'd finished making it. He was at the couch in 3 steps and had her hand before she was fully awake. "Hey, I'm here. Right here." "I had a bad dream," she said. Her voice was small. "I know. It's okay." "Where are we?" "Home, Bug. We're home. You're on the couch." She blinked at the fire, then at Evelyn, then back at her father. The disorientation cleared and the present reassembled itself in her face. "Oh," she said, "the storm lady." "Yeah." Lily looked at Evelyn with a child's uncomplicated directness. "Are you feeling better?" "A little," Evelyn said. "Thank you for the blanket. It helped." Lily considered this seriously, the way she considered most things. "Are you staying until morning?" "That's the plan," Mason said, before Evelyn could answer. "Okay." Lily lay back down. She pulled 2 of her blankets up to her chin and looked at the ceiling for a moment. "Daddy?" "Yeah. I'm not really tired anymore." "I know. Try anyway." "Can you tell me a story?" Mason glanced at Evelyn. Evelyn had the careful, neutral expression of someone making sure their face is not contributing to anything. "Sure," Mason said. He pulled his chair over to the couch and sat close. "Close your eyes, though." Lily closed her eyes with the theatricality of a child who is demonstrating compliance without fully committing to it. He told her the story he always told her when she couldn't sleep, a story he'd been making up in installments for about a year, about a girl who could talk to rivers, and the river that ran under their county that was ancient and sometimes grumpy and knew where everything that had ever been lost had gone. It wasn't a sophisticated story. It had inconsistencies that Lily occasionally pointed out with devastating accuracy. But it was theirs, specifically theirs, the accumulated invention of a father who wasn't a natural storyteller but had shown up night after night and invented something out of the available materials. Evelyn sat across the room and listened. She didn't look at them directly. She looked at the fire, but she was listening. He could tell by the way she was very still, stiller than the stillness she used for thinking. This was a different kind of still. Lily was asleep again in about 12 minutes. Mason sat for another minute after, to be sure, then moved his chair back to where it had been and sat down and looked at the clock. 2:14. 3 hours and 46 minutes. "You're a good father," Evelyn said quietly. He didn't say anything. "I mean it, not as—" She stopped. "I just mean it." "She makes it easy," he said. "Most of the time." Another silence. The fire needed feeding again. He fed it. He was putting the last log in place when he heard it. Not the storm. He'd been filtering the storm for hours. Had it cataloged, knew its sounds, knew the shutter upstairs that banged and the particular pitch the east-facing windows hit when the wind came from the northeast. This was different. This was a sound underneath the storm, separate from it, that his body registered before his conscious mind did because his body was paying attention to everything in the way that bodies do when they understand the situation, even when you're trying not to think about it too directly. He straightened slowly. Evelyn had heard it too. He could see it in the way she'd gone rigid. It was an engine. Not close, not in the driveway, but not far enough. The sound of something that had stopped, something that had come as far as it could on the buried road and had stopped. "How long ago did you run off Route 9?" Mason said, very quietly. "Roughly 2:45, 3 hours ago. Long enough for them to regroup, find a vehicle with better clearance." He moved to the window and stood to the side of it and looked out carefully, keeping himself out of the sight line of anyone looking back. The snow had eased. Not stopped, but eased. And the dark was less absolute than it had been an hour ago. In the distance, at the edge of where the road should have been, he could see the faint amber wash of headlights that had just gone off. He stepped away from the window. "They're here," he said. Evelyn was already moving. The blankets were off, the waterproof case already in her coat pocket. She'd been ready, he realized, in the specific way you're ready when you've been running long enough that ready becomes a resting state. She stood, and her face was set. The calculation already done, already past the part where things were uncertain and into the part where you just execute. "Lily," he said, clear, steady, no panic in it. Lily came awake instantly. Children who have learned to listen for a parent's voice in the night hear things in the register of it that the parent doesn't always know they're broadcasting. She sat up and looked at him. "I need you to be very brave right now," he said. "Like we talked about. Remember when we talked about what to do if something happened and I needed you to be really still and really quiet?" He had talked to her about this. Not recently, not in a way that was about tonight. It had been part of the general education of raising a child alone in an isolated house, the same conversation that covered what to do if he was hurt and she needed to call for help, what to do if there was a fire. She remembered. He could see her remember. "Yes," she said, "I need you to go with Evelyn right now under the kitchen floor, and I need you to be completely quiet. Whatever you hear, whatever happens, you don't make a sound until I come and get you. Can you do that?" Lily looked at him for a moment. 6 years old, still half in sleep, blankets around her shoulders, plastic dinosaurs somewhere in the couch cushions. She was scared. He could see it. He could always see it in her, in the specific way her face got very careful when she was frightened. But she was also his daughter, and she did the thing that he had always loved and feared about her in equal measure, which was that she didn't fall apart. She took it in and went solid with it. "Yes," she said again. "Good girl." He looked at Evelyn. Evelyn was already at the kitchen doorway. She had the flashlight he'd given her. Small, low output, a red light setting that wouldn't bleed through the floorboards. She had Lily's fox blanket under her arm. She met his eyes. There was a lot in that look. He didn't have time to sort through all of it, and neither did she, so neither of them tried. 6 o'clock, he said. 6 o'clock, she confirmed. He crouched down in front of Lily and held her face in both hands for a second. Her small, serious face, her dark eyes, the specific warmth of her that he had never been able to adequately describe to anyone. "I love you, Bug." "I love you, Daddy." Her voice was perfectly steady. It cost her something to keep it that way. He could see that, but she kept it that way. He stood up. He kissed the top of her head. Then he went to the mudroom and got the hammer. The weight of it was familiar. He'd driven so many nails with this particular hammer that his hand knew it the way your hand knows your own name. Without thought, without adjustment, just recognition. He held it at his side and went through the ground floor quickly, not turning on any lights. He knew this house in the dark the way he knew it in daylight. He checked the mudroom door. Dead bolted, but the bolt was old and the frame around it had some give. He shoved a kitchen chair under the handle. Same with the back door. He went to the front door and stood beside it and listened. Nothing yet. They'd be moving through the snow. Slow going, 3 feet of it, more in the drifts. He calculated angles, so from where the headlights had stopped to the house was maybe 400 feet across open ground. In these conditions, probably 8 to 10 minutes. Maybe less if they were moving fast and didn't care about noise. He went back to the kitchen. The hatch was closed, the rug back over it. He pulled the kitchen table over the rug, not to hide it, that wouldn't fool anyone, but because it would take a few seconds to move, and a few seconds was a few seconds. Then he went to the living room and let the fire burn low. Not out. He didn't want the house going dark. Didn't want whatever was outside to see a change and adjust their approach, but low enough that the room was dim. He moved the remaining firewood so it wasn't visible through the window. Small things. Buying increments. He positioned himself in the hallway between the living room and the kitchen, where he could see both the front door and the back hallway simultaneously. And he waited. His heart was doing something unpleasant. Not panic. He'd been in bad situations on job sites, had been present when scaffolding collapsed, when a wall came down wrong, when a man 30 feet up had grabbed the wrong handhold. He knew what his body did under pressure, knew its particular brand of chemistry, and what it was doing now was not panic. It was more like the cold, mechanical preparation of something that knows it's going to be asked to do something hard and is getting its systems in order. He thought about Lily. He thought about Sarah. Not the way he usually thought about her, the way that hurt, but in a different way. He thought about the documents Sarah had found in a box of estate papers, and the thread she'd pulled, and what pulling it had cost her. He thought about the thing he'd said to Evelyn earlier, that Sarah would have wanted it to matter. He held on to that. The sound came from the front of the house first. Not a knock. A test. Wait on the porch steps, careful, the sound of someone who is checking whether the boards announce them. They did. Mason had known every creak in those steps since childhood. Then silence for almost a full minute. Then, very quietly, someone tried the front door handle. The deadbolt held. Another silence. Then he heard them moving around the outside of the house. The soft compression of footsteps in packed snow. Regular, deliberate, someone doing exactly what Evelyn had described, establishing the perimeter, identifying exits, being professional about it. He counted. He tracked the sound around the north side, pausing at the cellar bulkhead, then continuing to the back. A pause at the back door, then the garage. Then silence for longer than he expected. The kitchen window. It was the one he'd known they'd find. Older than the others, the lock mechanism worn, the kind of thing that a professional looks at and knows immediately. He heard the almost inaudible sound of the mechanism being worked, and then the window swung inward on its old hinges with a sound that was quieter than it had any right to be. Mason was already moving. He came around the kitchen doorframe as the first man came through the window. There was a fraction of a second where the man hadn't fully found his footing on the kitchen floor and was still half in and half out, his weight distributed wrong. And Mason used that fraction of a second because it was what he had. The hammer connected with the man's right forearm. Mason's target was the weapon, always the weapon first. And the sound it made was not a good sound, and the weapon, a compact pistol with a suppressor attached, hit the kitchen floor and slid under the refrigerator. The man made a sound and grabbed his arm, and Mason hit him again, lower, a hard shot to the hip that dropped him sideways, and the man went down between the refrigerator and the cabinet and stayed down. Not unconscious, but not getting up immediately either. Mason grabbed the window and got it closed and threw the lock. It wouldn't hold. The lock was already compromised. But it bought seconds. He heard the front door. They had tools for the deadbolt. He'd known they would. He heard it working, and he moved to the hallway and put his back against the wall beside the door frame and waited. The deadbolt cleared, and the door came open, and the cold hit him again. That same physical wall of it from when he'd found Evelyn on the porch. And a man came through the door moving with the controlled efficiency of someone who had done this before many times and expected it to be over quickly. The hallway was narrow. That was its only advantage, but it was a real one. It collapsed the geometry of the encounter, made flanking impossible, meant that better numbers didn't translate to the kind of advantage they should have. Mason had built things in tight spaces his whole career. He understood what a narrow corridor did to a situation. The second man was bigger than Mason and moving faster than Mason would have liked, and he had his weapon up before Mason could close the distance enough to make the hammer useful, which meant Mason did something he hadn't specifically planned and hoped worked, which was that he dropped straight down, below the weapon's angle, and drove forward and came up hard inside the man's reach, too close for the gun to be pointed at anything useful. The collision was significant. Both of them hit the hallway wall. Mason got the hammer up and the man blocked it and got an elbow into Mason's face that made his vision go sideways for a moment, a bright, unpleasant burst across his left eye that he filed away for later and ignored now. And then they were in the kind of close quarters thing that doesn't look like the movies, that is mostly ugly and effortful and decided by small margins. Who has better footing? Who has more in reserve? Who has more reason to keep going? Mason had more reason. He got the hammer into something that connected, not clean, not exactly where he'd aimed, but enough. And the man's weapon discharged. The sound of it inside the hallway was enormous, and entirely swallowed by the storm outside almost immediately. The shot went into the ceiling and plaster dust came down. The man's grip on the weapon went wrong and Mason got it away from him and threw it down the hallway into the dark. The man hit him twice more, one in the ribs, one across the jaw. The jaw one was bad. He felt the specific badness of it, the way the impact traveled up through his skull, and he went back against the opposite wall and used the wall to stay up and got the hammer between them. "Stop," Mason said. His voice came out rougher than he intended. "I don't want to hurt you any more than this." The man looked at him. He was big, professionally still, and his breathing was controlled in a way that told Mason he was trained, which Mason had already known, and that he wasn't done, which Mason had also already known. "Where is she?" the man said. "Not here," Mason said. "We know she came to this house." "She came here and she left," Mason said. "She took my truck before the driveway closed. You're about 4 hours behind her." It was a bad lie. They both knew it. The truck was in the garage and clearly hadn't moved. But it was a lie designed to do one thing only, which was take up seconds, and it took up approximately 3 of them before the man moved again. Mason was ready for it this time. He wasn't ready for the third man. The third one came through the front door behind the second, and Mason, who had committed to a position to handle the second, had nothing left to give to the direction the third was coming from. And a moment later, he was on the floor of his grandfather's hallway with his back against the baseboard, and someone's knee on his chest, and the hallway spinning in the way that things spin when your head has been hit enough times that your brain is no longer fully collaborating. He kept hold of the hammer. He didn't know why exactly. It wasn't strategic. There was a man with a knee on his chest and another one standing over him, and the third one was still in the kitchen dealing with whatever was happening to his arm. And Mason's nose was bleeding onto the floor and his left eye was nearly closed. And he kept hold of the hammer because it was the one thing in this situation he had any control over, and he was not going to let go of it. "The woman," the man with the knee said. Same flat professional voice as the other one. "Where?" "I told you," Mason said. His voice was not pretty. "She left." The man increased the pressure on his chest. Mason's cracked hallway ceiling swam above him. There was plaster dust in his hair from the shot that had gone up. "Last time," the man said. Mason was calculating. Not the smart kind of calculating, not the kind with good options, the desperate kind with bad options and worse options, which is a different thing. The kitchen hatch was under the table, was under the rug, and they hadn't found it. And as long as he said nothing, and they found nothing, Evelyn and Lily were invisible. Invisible and waiting. 4:53, the clock on the wall said. 1 hour and 7 minutes to 6. "She's not here," Mason said, and took the consequence of saying it, which was not pleasant, and which he absorbed with his eyes open because he was not going to look away from any of this. He had lost track of what was happening to his face. There was a general throbbing that had replaced the specific individual pains from earlier, the way it does when the damage accumulates past the point of itemization. He was still conscious. He was still on the floor. He was still holding the hammer. He thought about Lily, 2 feet below him in the dirt, lying still in the dark with Evelyn's arm around her. He thought, 1 hour. 1 hour. Then something changed. It was the man in the kitchen. He said something, one word, sharp, in a language that wasn't English. And the 2 men in the hallway looked at each other, and one of them moved to the kitchen doorway. Mason used the half-second of shifted attention to drag himself upright against the wall. His left eye was mostly closed now. His ribs on the right side had joined the general complaint his body was making. He was standing because the wall was helping. The third man had found something. Mason could hear him moving differently in the kitchen, moving with purpose in a specific direction, and his blood went cold in the specific way that blood goes cold when you understand what's about to happen half a second before it does. The table. The man had found the table, and now he was moving the table. Mason launched himself off the wall. He came through the kitchen doorway and hit the third man from behind before he'd gotten the table fully clear of the rug, and this was messy and desperate and had no real technique to it. It was just a man throwing himself at another man to stop something from happening, the pure physical grammar of no other option. And it worked in the sense that the table went back over the rug, and the third man went forward into the counter, and his injured arm hit the edge of it, and he made a sound. Then the other two were in the kitchen. Mason was on his knees on the kitchen floor between them and the hatch. He was aware that this was not a sustainable position. He was also aware that the clock on the hallway wall said 4:57, and he was aware of the exact sound of Lily breathing in the dark beneath his knees, or imagining that he was, which was more or less the same thing in terms of what it did to his ability to get back on his feet. He got back on his feet. The man in front of him looked at him with a professional blankness that was, in its way, more frightening than anger would have been. Anger has a temperature. Anger makes mistakes. Blankness just keeps going. "You're not going to stop this," the man said. "I know," Mason said. Blood from his nose was dripping onto his shirt. He was holding the hammer with both hands now, the way you hold something when your grip isn't what it was. "But I'm going to keep doing it anyway." The man took a step forward, and from outside the house, from every direction at once it seemed, came lights, not the amber of the headlights that had gone off an hour ago. White lights, multiple, brilliant, and sweeping, the kind that come from vehicles built to go through 3 feet of snow and don't stop. Through the kitchen window, the world outside went suddenly, completely white, and behind the lights came sound, the low-frequency authority of helicopter rotors, and beneath them the crackle of a PA system that said, with complete clarity despite the storm and the distance, "Federal agents, all occupants, this is a federal tactical unit. You are surrounded. Do not move." The kitchen went very still. The 3 men looked at each other, and that look was the entire calculation of their situation. The lights, the rotors, the voice, the fact that whatever contingency they'd had for this scenario was clearly not going to be sufficient, and then the man with the blankness in his face made the specific small movement of a man who is deciding not to reach for his weapon, which was the first genuinely good decision anyone other than Mason had made in this kitchen all night. Mason lowered the hammer. His arm was shaking. He became aware of this now, the deep muscular tremble of something that has been asked to do too much for too long. He lowered the hammer and leaned against the kitchen wall and looked at the white light flooding through the window and breathed. Outside, the storm had broken. Not entirely, not cleanly. It was still snowing, still winter, still the middle of the night in an isolated farmhouse in the worst weather in 30 years. But the ceiling had lifted. The rotors were real. The voices were real. He went to the kitchen hatch and moved the table himself, slowly, and pulled the rug aside and grabbed the iron ring and pulled it up, and the cold from below came up into the kitchen, and he looked down into the dark. "It's me," he said. "It's over. You can come up." A moment. Then the small red flashlight clicked on below, and Evelyn's face appeared in the opening, looking up at him with an expression that was doing too many things to have a name. He reached down and got Lily first, who came up into his arms and locked both of hers around his neck, without saying anything, just held on, and he stood in his kitchen holding his daughter, while outside the federal vehicles arranged themselves across what had been the driveway. And the voices got closer, and the men who had come to his house in the dark stood very still and waited for what was coming for them. He held Lily. He held her until he stopped shaking. The first federal agent through the front door was a woman, which Mason registered only because he'd been expecting men in the specific military mold, and she wasn't that. She was maybe 40, medium height, moving with the controlled economy of someone who had cleared a lot of rooms and was not impressed by the ones who tried to make it difficult. She had a tactical vest over a dark jacket, and her weapon was up and then it wasn't, assessing the kitchen in under 3 seconds and determining that the situation had already resolved itself into something she could work with. Her eyes went to Mason first, the blood on his face, Lily in his arms, the hammer on the counter, and then to the 3 men standing in various states of damage against the far wall, and then to Evelyn, who had come up out of the hatch behind Lily and was standing with one hand on the kitchen door frame, the waterproof case visible in her other hand. "Sterling," the agent said. "Carver," Evelyn said back. A name, not a greeting. The specific shorthand of people who have been in contact long enough to dispense with the preamble. "You missed 2 check-ins." I'm aware. We moved on the second one. Weather pushed the timeline. The agent, Carver, looked at Mason again. You the homeowner? Mason Carter, he said. Lily's head was on his shoulder. He was not putting her down. You're going to need a medic. I know. We have one outside. She looked back at her team, two more agents bracketing the three men against the wall. Get them out, she said. Not loud, just said it. And the agents moved, and the three men, professional, resigned, calculating whatever they were going to calculate later, went without a fight through the back door into the white-lit cold. Just like that, they were gone, and the kitchen had 4 people in it instead of 7. And the sudden reduction in human mass made the room feel strange, too large for what was left in it. Mason set Lily down on the kitchen floor and crouched in front of her and looked at her face. She was pale. Her eyes were wide and dry. She hadn't cried, not once, which was its own specific thing he was going to think about later, the way children sometimes save it all for afterward. She was looking at him with the careful, assessing look she'd been using since she was old enough to have one, looking at the damage on his face the way she looked at things she was trying to understand. You got hurt, she said. A little, he said. Does it hurt a lot? Some, he said, because she always knew when he lied about that. But I'm okay. Everything's okay. She looked at him for another moment, then she put both her hands on his face, small and careful, and looked at him very seriously, the way she'd seen him look at her when she'd fallen off the back porch 2 summers ago and split her chin open. Assessing, making sure. Okay, she said when she'd finished her assessment. Okay, he agreed. She dropped her hands and turned and looked at Evelyn. You can keep the fox blanket, she said. You can have it. Evelyn looked at her. Something moved through her face that she didn't fully manage to keep contained. Thank you, Lily, she said. Her voice was almost steady. Outside, the sound of the federal vehicles and the lessening rotor noise as the helicopter moved to a holding position. Through the kitchen window, the world was still white-lit, surreal. The farmhouse and its buried driveway and its old trees transformed by the portable lights into something that looked like a set from a film about a thing that happened to other people. The medic came in through the back door, young, male, businesslike. And Mason submitted to being looked at because Lily was watching, and he didn't want to model the thing where you refuse medical help on the grounds of not wanting to admit how much something hurts. The verdict was possible concussion, definitely a broken nose, 2 ribs that needed imaging to assess properly, and various contusions that the medic cataloged with the neutral efficiency of someone for whom this kind of inventory was Tuesday. He taped Mason's nose, which was deeply unpleasant, and gave him something for the pain and told him he needed a hospital when the roads opened. When do the roads open? Mason said. Probably 6, 7 hours. Storms breaking faster than the forecast. Mason nodded. He could live with 6 hours. He'd already lived with the past 6. Agent Carver had taken Evelyn to the living room. Mason could hear them talking. Not the words, just the cadence of it. 2 people who have been operating in parallel on the same problem and are now doing the work of merging their separate threads. Evelyn's voice was low and steady. Carver's was lower. At one point there was a silence that lasted almost a minute, and Mason had the sense of something significant being confirmed or transferred, the waterproof case changing hands or its contents being verified. He sat in the kitchen with Lily on his lap and a mug of water the medic had poured for him, and he looked at the hatch in the floor that he'd used to hide his daughter from men with guns in his grandfather's house, and he thought about the specific shape of the last 8 hours. Lily fell asleep on him around 5:15, just went out, leaning against his chest, the way she sometimes fell asleep in the car on long drives. Without announcement, without transition, the child's ability to simply stop and let the body do what it needs. He held her and didn't move. Around 5:45, Evelyn came back to the kitchen. She looked worse in the better light than she had by firelight. The bruising on her jaw was coming up fully now, dark and spreading, and the taped gauze over her temple had a small, fresh stain at the center where the cut had seeped again. The medic had been at her too. He could see that, had redone the tape more professionally, had looked at the ribs and determined the same thing he'd determined about Mason's hospital when available. She stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at him with Lily asleep against him and said nothing for a moment. "Well," she said. "Well," he said back. She came and sat in the kitchen chair across from him. The kitchen table was still off-center where they'd moved it. Neither of them moved it back. "The file transmitted at 6:02, she said, 4 minutes late because Daniel's system had a connectivity delay from the storm. He's fine, by the way. He's been in a safe house in Vermont for 6 days. Good, Mason said. Carver says the arrests will start this morning. There are warrants ready. They've been ready for 2 months, waiting on the file to make the package complete. 11 people. It'll take most of the day to execute all of them because of the geographic spread, but by tonight, she stopped. By tonight, they'll all be in federal custody. Mason shifted slightly to keep Lily balanced. All 11. All 11? The prosecutor. He was arrested at his home at 5:58 this morning. His wife was apparently making breakfast. Evelyn said this without satisfaction, or with only the grim, tired variety of satisfaction that doesn't feel like much when you finally get there. He'll have the most complicated defense, probably, given his position, but the evidence against him is... Carver used the word comprehensive. She doesn't really use adjectives, so I took that as meaningful. Yeah, Mason said. A silence. Outside, someone was giving instructions in a calm federal agent voice about vehicle positioning. The light through the window was starting to change. Not sunrise yet, but the sky lightening almost imperceptibly at the edges in the east, that first faint suggestion that the dark has a limit. Your father's case will be reopened formally, Evelyn said. Carver confirmed it. It'll go through a different channel than the original investigation, a dedicated unit that handles the systemic cases, the ones where the original investigation was compromised. It won't be fast. These things take... I know what these things take, Mason said. I'm not in a hurry anymore. I just need it to be real. It's real, she said. He looked at her. I know you need me to say it directly, she said. So I'm saying it directly. What happened to your father was real and documented and will be prosecuted as murder, because that's what it was. What happened to Sarah was real and documented and will be prosecuted the same way. The men who ordered it and the men who executed it are either in custody now or will be before the day is over. I know that doesn't... She stopped, started again. I know that doesn't give you back what you lost. I'm not saying it does. I'm just saying it's real. Mason looked at his sleeping daughter. He thought about Thomas Carter, his father, a forensic accountant who had been good at finding the things that weren't there, who had built a picture piece by careful piece and had not gotten to finish it. He thought about the man his father had been outside of work, the way he smelled like coffee and sawdust, the way he argued about baseball with a passion completely disproportionate to his general interest in sports, the way he'd shown up to every one of Mason's construction jobs in the early years with a thermos and opinions about the structural choices. A specific man, a whole specific man, gone. He thought about Sarah standing in a hallway, arguing about a movie she hadn't seen, the thread she'd pulled, the library, the estate donation, the 15-year-old memos in a dead man's boxes, and the particular kind of stubbornness that could not leave a wrong thing alone. It matters, he said. Not to Evelyn specifically, just out loud. Yes, Evelyn said. It does. The medic came through and checked Lily briefly without waking her, declared her fine, said something about shock responses in children and what to watch for, and left again. The federal agents outside were doing what federal agents do after a scene is secured, the specific organized activity of people filling out the next 3 months of their professional lives in real time. Someone was photographing the kitchen window. Someone was bagging the weapons. Someone was on a phone call that seemed to involve a lot of careful legal language. Carver came back into the kitchen around 6:15. She looked at Mason with the direct, assessing look she'd given him when she first came through the door, the kind that compiles information quickly and doesn't waste time on sentiment. Mr. Carter, she said, I want to ask you a few questions when you're ready. Not right now. I can see you're occupied. Her eyes went briefly to Lily. But in the next hour or so, before we move the scene. Sure, Mason said. I also want to say... She paused. Not uncomfortably, just briefly, the way someone pauses when they're being precise. What you did tonight was not something we'd recommend officially. Going at 3 armed professionals with a construction hammer is not. That's not in any playbook we'd hand you. I know, Mason said, but the fact that they were contained in this structure, unable to move to a secondary location, is a significant part of why this went the way it did. If they'd left here with Sterling before we arrived, she didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. I just wanted to say that, unofficially. She went back to the living room without waiting for him to respond, which he appreciated, because he didn't have a response that wasn't either too much or too little. Evelyn had been watching this exchange. When Carver left, she said, "She's not wrong." "I know she's not. You could have been killed." "I know that too." "Mason." "Evelyn." He said it the same way she'd said his name the night before, that first time on the porch. The shape of a name that has weight. "I know what the risk was. I made the choice I could live with. Let's just leave it there." She looked at him for a moment, then she let it be. One of the things he'd always been able to do with her, in the old days, was disagree without one of them needing to resolve it immediately. And apparently that was still functional between them, even after 8 years and everything that had happened in them. The sky outside kept lightening. By 7, the gray of it was definite. The storm fully broken now. The snow still on the ground in its deep, impossible quantities, but no longer coming down. The white world outside the kitchen window was starting to take on the specific blue-silver quality of very early winter morning, the kind of light that makes everything look both sharper and more fragile than it actually is. Lily woke up at 7:15, slowly, in pieces, the way she woke up in the mornings when she wasn't being rushed. She came back to herself gradually. Awareness of where she was, awareness of the sound of people outside and the strange light, awareness of her father's arms. She lifted her head and blinked. "Are those police?" she said. She was looking out the window at the federal vehicles in the driveway. "Sort of," Mason said. "Federal agents, like police but for bigger problems." She considered this. Did they fix the problem? "They're working on it." She looked at Evelyn. "Are you okay now?" "I'm getting there," Evelyn said. Lily nodded slowly, absorbing this, and then she said, "I'm hungry." "Yeah," Mason said. "Me too." He looked at the cabinet. "I have crackers and peanut butter." "I know," Lily said, with the tone of someone who has strong feelings about this, but recognizes the limitations of the situation. "Can we have eggs when the power comes back?" "First thing," he said. "With the hot sauce?" "With the hot sauce." She settled back against him, satisfied with this agreement, and looked around the kitchen at the federal agents moving through it, and the table that was still crooked, and the window that someone had taped up with plastic from a kit they'd brought with them, and she said, "The storm stopped." "Yeah," Mason said. "It did." "Is everything going to be okay now?" He thought about this. He was not a man who made promises he couldn't keep, and the question of what okay meant was one that was going to take a lot longer to answer than the next hour or the next day. There was a lot that was going to happen. The hospital, the federal interviews, the legal proceedings that would unspool over the next year or two, the reopening of his father's case and Sarah's case, the slow institutional work of making something real in the language of courts and evidence and official record. None of it was going to be clean or quick or easy, but the men who had killed his father and killed his wife were going to answer for it. The network that had operated for 15 years in the invisible space between legitimate business and organized crime was broken at the foundation. And he was in his kitchen in his grandfather's house with his daughter in his lap, and the storm was done. "Yeah, Bug," he said. "I think so." She took this at face value, the way she took most things he told her, with the particular trust of a child who has learned that when her father says something directly, it's because he believes it. She reached for the crackers on the counter that Mason had left out the night before, and took one and ate it with the sound of someone who is genuinely hungry and does not care about decorum. Evelyn watched them from across the table. She had a mug of something. The medic had found instant coffee in the cabinet and produced it without being asked, which Mason had found inexplicably moving, and she was holding it with both hands in the way she'd held the soup the night before, like warmth was still something she was calibrating. She looked tired. Not the tired of a single difficult night. That was there too, but underneath it was the other kind, the specific exhaustion of someone who has been running on purpose and willpower for years and has just put down a very heavy thing and doesn't quite know yet what their body feels like without the weight of it. Mason looked at her and she looked back at him, and neither of them said anything for a moment. There was too much to say. There was the 8 years and the choices she'd made in them, and the choices he'd made and the losses that sat between them that no amount of explanation or evidence or federal prosecution was going to fully account for. There was the specific anger that hadn't gone anywhere just because the night was over, the anger at years of not knowing, at a grief he'd carried with the wrong shape because he'd been missing the information that would have given it the right one. There was the fact that she'd been carrying something for 8 years that no person should carry alone, and had carried it anyway, had carried it with a kind of terrible discipline that he understood even while he resented it. All of that was there, and none of it was going to resolve itself this morning. In a broken kitchen, with federal agents moving around them, and a 6-year-old eating crackers in his lap. "Lily," Mason said, "can you go with that agent in the living room for a few minutes? She has a phone, and you can pick something to watch." Lily looked at him, looked at Evelyn, executed the calculation of a child who understands that the adults need a minute, and slid off his lap with her crackers. "Okay," she said, and went to the living room. Mason and Evelyn were alone in the kitchen. He looked at his hands on the table. The knuckles were scraped. The right one was slightly swollen at the middle joint in a way that was going to be uncomfortable for a while. He turned them over and looked at the palms, which were marked with the calluses of 10 years of construction work, of building things. "I don't forgive you," he said. He said it quietly, without heat. "Not yet. I need you to know that." "I know," she said. "I understand why you did what you did. That's different from forgiving it. I know that too. The understanding is, it's not nothing. I want to be clear about that. What you told me last night," he stopped. "It changes the shape of things. It doesn't change that they happened, but it changes the shape. And I need time to figure out what that means." "Okay," she said. "That's all I've got right now." "That's enough," she said. Then, "More than I expected." He looked at her. "I came to your door last night not knowing if you'd let me in," she said. "I thought there was a reasonable chance you'd recognize me and close the door in my face and let me freeze on the porch. I had the thought, running through your field in the dark, that you'd be entirely within your rights to do that." "I considered it," he said. Something shifted at the corner of her mouth, not the almost smile from the night before. Something more complicated and less guarded. "I know," she said, "but you didn't." "No," he said, "I didn't." Another silence. Outside, one of the federal vehicles started its engine. The sound of it was ordinary and enormous at the same time, the sound of the regular world remembering itself and starting to come back. "What happens to you now?" Mason said. "With the company." She exhaled. "The legitimate side of Sterling Capital it'll survive probably with significant restructuring. The board will want distance from everything. There'll be proceedings, civil liability, a lot of very expensive lawyers working very long hours. I'll step back from operations." She turned the mug in her hands. "I've been thinking about stepping back for a while, even before all of this. The company was always my father's project more than mine. I think I stayed in it because leaving felt like giving something up, and I wasn't ready to figure out what. And now? And now I think I know what I'd rather do with the time." She looked up at him. "I want to be clear about something, Mason. I'm not here asking for anything. I know that's probably what this looks like. That I show up, I tell you the truth, I save myself and maybe buy back something I gave up. I know that's how it reads." "How does it actually read?" he said. "I showed up because I had nowhere else to go and I was out of road," she said. "That's the truth of it. Everything else that's happened tonight, everything I told you, I would have told you years ago if I'd been braver or smarter or less afraid. I don't get credit for telling you now. I needed you to know." Mason was quiet for a while. "There was a question I never asked you," he said, "back then, before everything." She waited. "When you ended it." I never asked you directly why. You gave me the version there was an official version. It wasn't a fight. It was just a conversation that closed a door. And I walked out of it, and I spent 6 months trying to decide if I was angry or sad or both. And eventually He stopped. I moved on, but I never asked directly because I think part of me was afraid of the answer. What would you have asked? She said. I would have asked if any of it was real. He held her gaze. The year. All of it. I would have asked if it was real or if it was just... He didn't finish it. She looked at him for a long moment. The kitchen was quiet. The federal agents were outside and Lily was in the living room, and the early morning came through the frost-edged window in its pale blue-silver light. It was real, she said. No qualification, no softening, just that. He nodded. He looked at the table. Okay, he said. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't resolution. It was just a small thing being acknowledged, a piece of the shape he'd been figuring out. He filed it where it belonged and let it sit. Carver came back at 7:45 and took Mason's statement at the kitchen table while Lily ate more crackers in the living room and Evelyn sat with her through it, which had not been discussed or arranged, but simply happened, Evelyn sitting on the couch beside Lily, and the two of them watching something on the agent's phone with the volume low, Lily, at one point saying something that made Evelyn respond with a short, quiet laugh that Mason heard from the kitchen and didn't look up from the table for. The statement took 40 minutes. Carver was thorough and unrushed, and asked good questions in the flat, neutral tone of someone who needs precise answers and is not interested in your interpretation of events, just the events. Mason gave her what she asked for accurately and completely, including the part where he hit the first man with the hammer, because he had decided in the middle of the night that he was not going to be a person who was unclear about what he'd done or why. When it was over, Carver closed her notebook and said, "One more thing." Yeah. The evidence Evelyn Sterling collected over the past 8 years is extensive and well documented. It will be sufficient for prosecution on all counts, but there will be a point in these proceedings where testimony becomes important, from people who were directly affected, who have standing in the cases. That includes you. She looked at him steadily. Are you prepared for that? Yes, he said. No hesitation. It's not a simple process. It can take Agent Carver. He said it respectfully. My father was killed and my wife was killed, and someone spent 8 years building a case to hold the people responsible for it. Yes, I'll testify. I'll do whatever it takes. She looked at him for a moment, the same assessing look she'd had from the beginning. Okay, she said. She stood up. We'll be in touch. She left, and Mason sat alone at the crooked kitchen table in the slowly brightening morning, and the house settled around him the way old houses settle, creaking, adjusting, the particular language of wood and stone that has been standing through weather for 90 years and expects to be standing for 90 more. He got up and straightened the kitchen table. Then he went to the doorway between the kitchen and the living room and leaned against the frame and looked at his daughter on the couch, her cartoon fox blanket around her shoulders, the borrowed phone on her lap. Evelyn was beside her, close enough that Lily had at some point leaned slightly against Evelyn's arm without either of them appearing to have decided this. Evelyn's head was tipped back against the couch, eyes closed, exhaustion finally having overridden whatever had been keeping her upright. She was asleep, or close to it. Her face in sleep looked younger. The calculation went out of it, and what was left was just a person who had been running for a very long time, and had finally, in the specific cold quiet of a winter morning after the worst night in years, stopped. Lily looked up and saw him in the doorway. She held one finger to her lips. He nodded. He went back to the kitchen and put water on the grate for more coffee and looked out the window at the world outside. The federal vehicles were still there, but quieter now. The urgent phase of the operation moved to other locations, other addresses, other mornings in other places where people were waking up to find that the thing they'd believed was solid ground was not. The snow on the driveway caught the early light and held it, and the trees beyond the fence line were heavy and white and still. The power came back at 8:47. Not announced, just suddenly there, the refrigerator cycling on, the digital clock on the microwave blinking its default zeros, the light over the sink that he'd left switched on, snapping to life. Ordinary electricity, ordinary light, the ordinary world pulling itself back together after the storm. Mason stood in the kitchen and looked at the light for a moment. Then he got the eggs out of the refrigerator and the hot sauce from the cabinet, and he started making breakfast. The eggs were slightly overdone because Mason had been watching the driveway instead of the pan, and the hot sauce was the cheap kind that had been in the cabinet since last winter, but Lily ate 2 full servings and declared them perfect, which was the kind of verdict that settled the matter entirely. Evelyn woke up while he was cooking. He heard her move in the living room, the particular soft sound of someone coming back to themselves in an unfamiliar place. The brief disorientation before the previous 12 hours assembled themselves back into sequence. He heard her sit up. He heard her breathe. He didn't go in, just called through the doorway that there were eggs if she wanted them. And she appeared in the kitchen 3 minutes later looking like someone who had slept in a tactical vest on a couch after being chased through a blizzard with cracked ribs, which was exactly what she was. And she sat down at the table without comment and ate what he put in front of her. Lily watched her the whole time with the open, unembarrassed attention of a child who has decided someone is interesting and is gathering data. "You have a lot of bruises," Lily said. "I know," Evelyn said. "My dad has them too now." "I know that too." Lily considered this for a moment, turning her fork in her eggs. "Did the same people do it?" "Yes," Evelyn said. She said it simply, without softening it, which Mason noted. Evelyn had never been the kind of person who talked down to children, as though they couldn't handle the shape of true things. Lily nodded slowly. "Are those people in trouble now?" "A lot of trouble," Evelyn said. "Good," Lily said, with the clean moral certainty of a 6-year-old, and went back to her eggs. The roads opened at noon. By 11:30, the county plows had made a first pass on Route 9, and by 11:45, Mason could hear the sound of a plow working the secondary road that led to his driveway, the low mechanical grinding of heavy equipment doing the work of restoring the world to something navigable. He stood at the front window and watched the plow's amber light moving through the white distance and thought about the hospital, which he needed, and the calls he needed to make, and the things that would start happening now that the night was over and the day had properly begun. He'd already called his neighbor Linda, who was 71 and had a truck with chains and had looked after Lily before when things came up, and she'd said she'd be over within the hour. She'd also said, with the directness of a woman who had lived alone for 30 years and had stopped pretending not to notice things, "Mason Carter, your voice sounds like your face looks bad." And he'd said, "It's fine, Linda." And she'd said, "Mm-hmm," in the specific way that meant she would be making her own assessment when she arrived. Evelyn had made 2 calls of her own on the satellite phone one of the federal agents had left for her. The first, brief, to her lawyer, Daniel Reeves in Vermont. Mason heard only her end of it, which was mostly listening and then a few short confirmations. And when she hung up, she'd said, "He's fine," in a way that suggested the relief of it was larger than the 2 words accounted for. The second call was longer, to someone named Patricia, who turned out to be her assistant, and whom she was clearly reassuring on several fronts simultaneously, while also issuing a series of quiet, precise instructions about the company and what statements to make to whom. He heard her say, near the end of that call, "I'll need you to clear the next several weeks. I don't know exactly what the schedule looks like, but I know it doesn't look like what it looked like before." "Yes, all of it." She hung up and stood in the hallway for a moment with the phone in her hand, looking at nothing in particular. Then she looked up and saw Mason watching her from the kitchen doorway and straightened slightly, the reflex of someone used to not being caught in a moment of transition. "The next several weeks," Mason said. "There's a lot to handle," she said. "Legal proceedings have timelines. The company restructuring is going to require—" "That's not what I was asking about," he said. She held his gaze. Then she nodded, once, and went back to the living room, and he went back to the kitchen, and neither of them said anything else about it. But it had been said, in the particular way that things get said between people who have known each other long enough to understand that a sentence can end early and still be complete. Linda arrived at 12:20 in her truck with chains, exactly as promised, wearing a bright orange parka and the expression of a woman who had seen several things in 71 years and was prepared to absorb several more. She came through the front door and looked at Mason's face and said, "Lord above, Mason," and then immediately started making tea because that was Linda's response to most situations that required a response. And she listened to the abbreviated version of events that Mason gave her, with her arms crossed and her eyes moving between him and Evelyn, with the focused attention of someone updating her mental files in real time. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "The same people who took Thomas," she said. Not a question. "Yes," Mason said. Linda had known his father, had known his grandfather, had been a fixture in the periphery of Mason's life for as long as he could remember, the kind of neighbor who existed in a small county the way certain trees exist, so long established that you stopped registering them as having arrived at some point and simply accepted them as part of the landscape. She'd been one of the people at his father's funeral who had stood near the back and said nothing that tried to explain it or make it comfortable, which had made her one of the only people there he'd actually been glad to see. She looked at Evelyn. "And you're the one who built the case?" she said. "Yes," Evelyn said. Linda looked at her for a long moment with the unsentimental evaluation of a woman who had learned to take people at the full weight of their actions rather than their explanations of those actions. Then she nodded. "Lily can stay with me as long as you need," she said to Mason. "Both of you get to a hospital. The rest of it will keep." She took Lily, who went cheerfully, because she'd always liked Linda's house, which had a large orange cat named Senator and an inexhaustible supply of butter cookies. And the house went quiet in the specific way that houses go quiet when children leave them, a quality of stillness that is the direct absence of small, persistent noise. Mason and Evelyn drove to the regional hospital in his truck. The roads were rough. The first plow pass had cleared the surface, but the compacted snow underneath was still treacherous, and he drove carefully, both hands on the wheel, and she sat in the passenger seat looking out the window at the white countryside passing by. The world outside was pristine in the way it only ever is after a serious storm. Everything buried and equalized, the usual clutter of a landscape simplified down to shapes, the familiar made strange by the weight of white on every surface. They didn't talk much on the drive. There wasn't an awkwardness to the silence exactly. It was more like two people who had been through something very compressed and very intense together and were letting the ordinary motion of the world reassert itself around them before asking too much of language. The hospital was efficient, if not speedy. The ER had been quiet overnight because the storm had kept most emergencies home, and was now doing the steady business of a winter morning after a major weather event, which was mostly frostbite and one serious car accident on Route 12 that had kept 3 surgeons occupied since 7. Mason's nose was confirmed broken and reset by a doctor who was younger than he expected, and apologized in advance before doing it, which was the correct order of operations. 2 ribs on the right side were cracked, not broken through. The doctor said rest and pain management, and did not seem to find this advice as inadequate as Mason did, given that rest and pain management were not on the schedule he was anticipating for the next several months. He got a mild concussion diagnosis that came with a list of things to watch for, which he read once and folded into his pocket. Evelyn was in the adjacent bay for most of this. He could hear the medical conversations through the curtain in fragments. Ribs confirmed, 2 of them, the same verdict as Mason's, and a small hairline fracture in her right wrist that had been the bruised one, that had happened, from what he overheard, from grabbing something when the car went off the road. They put it in a soft cast. He didn't see it until she came around the curtain, and then he looked at it for a moment without saying anything. "Don't," she said. "I wasn't going to say anything. You had a face. I always have a face." This was a specific face. He looked away from the cast. "Fine. Let's go." They were back in the truck by 2 in the afternoon. The drive back was quieter than the drive there, or a different kind of quiet. The hospital had made things more real in the specific way that medical treatment makes things real, turning the accumulated damage of the night from something you're managing on adrenaline and necessity into something that exists on a chart with your name at the top. He pulled into his driveway, which the county plow had partially cleared, and turned off the engine, and they sat for a moment in the parked truck. "I should find a hotel," Evelyn said. "In town. There must be—" "The roads are still bad," Mason said. "I can manage. With a fractured wrist and 2 cracked ribs." "Mason, you can take the upstairs bedroom," he said. It's cold, but there's a space heater in the closet. It's not a hotel, but it's available, and you're not in any condition to be managing a hotel right now. He got out of the truck. Come on. She sat for another second. He could see her working through the response to this, the automatic resistance to being helped, the specific pride of someone who has been operating alone for so long that accepting help has become its own kind of problem. He'd known that about her before, and apparently it had not diminished in the intervening years. She got out of the truck. The next several days had a quality that Mason would later struggle to describe, even to himself. They were not comfortable exactly. There was too much happening, too many calls and federal interviews and legal communications arriving through Evelyn's phone, and increasingly through a lawyer of Mason's own that Agent Carver had connected him with, a federal victims advocate whose job was to make sure he understood his rights in the proceedings and wasn't navigating the machinery alone. There was the work of explaining things to Lily in increments, age-appropriate explanations that told the truth without the parts she didn't need yet. And Lily received these explanations with the focused seriousness she brought to most things, and asked questions that were sometimes simple and sometimes, out of nowhere, devastatingly perceptive. She asked, on the third day, while Mason was making dinner and Evelyn was at the kitchen table working through documents on a laptop her assistant had driven up from the city, "Is Evelyn staying?" Mason looked at Evelyn. Evelyn was looking at the laptop screen with the careful attention of someone who has heard a question they're going to let the other person answer. "For a while," Mason said, "while she's recovering. Her ribs need time." Lily considered this. "Okay," she said. Then, "She reads good stories." Mason looked at Evelyn again. Evelyn's eyes were still on the screen, but something at the corner of her mouth had moved. "Does she?" he said. "She did all the voices," Lily said. "Different ones. You always do the same voice." "I have one voice," Mason said. "It's a good voice." "It's fine," Lily said, with the diplomatic honesty of someone who has decided to be kind about it, and went back to whatever she was drawing. The arrest played out over the course of that first week. Mason followed them the way you follow something you've been waiting for years, with an intensity that is mixed with a strange hollowness, because the thing you've anticipated has a different shape when it's actually happening than it did when it lived only in the future. He read the news coverage on his phone in the evenings after Lily was asleep, the terse federal press releases and the longer reporting that filled in the context, the names of 11 people who were now processing through the federal system with their lawyers and their carefully maintained expressions of innocence that fooled no one, including, he suspected, themselves. The federal prosecutor's arrest got the most coverage. It was the kind of story that journalism does a particular kind of work around. The appointed guardian of the law revealed to be its longest-running internal enemy. The man who had sat at the head of a major investigations unit for 9 years while quietly ensuring that the right cases went cold and the right evidence got lost in the right filing systems. His arrest had been captured by a camera outside his home, a modest colonial on a street with old trees, the kind of house that is designed to communicate the idea of someone with nothing to hide. And the image that ran in most of the reporting showed him in a gray robe with his hands being cuffed behind his back while his wife stood in the doorway behind him holding a dish towel. Mason looked at that photograph for a long time. He thought about the police report on Sarah's death, the specific language of it, the careful absence of certain conclusions. He'd read that report so many times in the years since that he could have recited sections of it. He'd always known it was wrong. He'd just never been able to prove it. Now someone else had proved it. Evelyn had spent 8 years proving it. He put the phone face down on the nightstand and lay in the dark for a while and thought about what forgiveness actually was, whether it was a thing you decided or a thing that happened to you over time, whether it came in pieces or all at once, or whether some of it never came at all and you just learned to build around the parts that didn't. He didn't have the answer. He suspected he wasn't going to have it for a while. But he slept. For the first time in a long time. For the first time since he'd started keeping the knowledge in his chest like a stone, since the weight of it had become part of how he moved through his nights. He slept without waking at 3 and lying in the dark with the case files running behind his eyes. The weight wasn't gone, but it had a different quality. It had somewhere to go now. 2 weeks after the night of the blizzard, on a Saturday morning, Evelyn found Mason in the backyard. He was shoveling the path from the back door to the garage, which had filled back in with the snow that had slid off the roof overnight. It was cold and clear, the sky the specific February blue that happens when the air is too dry for clouds, and the sun is doing its best with limited authority. He was working steadily, the rhythm of it, the physical simplicity of moving snow from one place to another, which was one of the things he'd always liked about physical work. It was honest, it was direct, and it stayed done. She came and stood at the edge of the cleared path, in the good boots she'd had sent from the city, along with a more practical coat than the ruined one, watching him work. "I'm leaving on Tuesday," she said. He kept shoveling. "For the city. For a few days. Then Washington. There are meetings with the federal prosecution team that Daniel says I need to be present for. And then—" She paused. "I don't know yet. I told you I was stepping back from operations at the company. I meant it. What's on the other side of that is still—" She stopped again. He moved a shovelful of snow. "Still what?" "I don't know," she said. "That's the honest answer. I've been so focused on one direction for so long that the other directions aren't clear yet." He straightened up and looked at her. She was standing in the winter sunlight in his grandfather's backyard, her hair loose and her wrist in its soft cast, and her face showing the healing of 2 weeks in the specific, imperfect way that bruises heal. Not all at once, not evenly, the colors moving through their spectrum from dark to yellow to almost gone at their own pace. She looked like someone at the beginning of something rather than the end of something, which was a different look than the one she'd had on his porch in the blizzard, and he noticed the difference. "I want to be honest with you about something," she said. She said it with the careful precision of someone who has been thinking about a sentence for a while and is checking their commitment to saying it before they do. "I'm not leaving because I want to. I'm leaving because there are things I have to do, and most of them are not here. But I want to come back, not to—" She stopped. "Not with any expectation about what that means. I know there's a lot that isn't resolved. I'm not asking you to resolve it by Tuesday. I'm just telling you I want to come back, and I wanted you to know that before I left." Mason leaned on the shovel. "Lily is going to want updates on the federal case," he said. Evelyn blinked. "She's been following it," he said. "In the way that she's 6, so she follows it in the way I explain it to her, which is simplified, but she asks about it every few days. She'll want to know how the proceedings are going." Evelyn looked at him. She was working out what he was saying, not the words, the thing underneath them, the particular way he was answering a question without answering it directly, which she had always been able to do and which she was doing now. "I can do that," she said. "I can keep her updated." "And she's going to ask if you're coming back," he said. "So you should know that. She's going to ask, and when she asks, you need to have a real answer, not a diplomatic one. She's 6, not 12, and she doesn't have the patience for diplomatic." "Okay," Evelyn said. Her voice was very careful. "So if you tell me you're coming back," he said, "I need it to be the real thing, not the thing you intend when you're standing in someone's backyard in the winter feeling a certain way about it. The thing that's still true in 6 months." She was quiet for a long moment. The cold air moved between them. A crow landed in the far maple and looked at both of them with the blank assessment of a bird that has no opinion about human complications. "I'm coming back," she said. "That's the real thing." He looked at her for another moment. Then he went back to shoveling. She stood there for a moment, then she picked up the second shovel that was leaning against the house wall. He hadn't asked her to, she just picked it up, and started working the other side of the path. They worked in silence for a while, the 2 shovels finding their own rhythm, not synchronized but not working against each other either. The snow moved and the path cleared, and the cold air turned their breath to steam that the wind took away. "I owe you something," she said, without stopping. "For the house." "You don't owe me anything," he said. "Mason, what happened in that house happened because people with guns came to it, and those people came to it because of a criminal organization that has been operating for 15 years, and that's not a thing I'm going to invoice you for." He moved a shovelful. "Put the money somewhere useful." "Like where?" He thought about it. He thought about the library 2 towns over where Sarah had worked, the one that had the resource databases that Sarah had used to pull financial records on a dead winter evening, that had the estate donation system that had received a dead man's boxes of papers and given them to a librarian who couldn't put down a wrong thing. A library that almost certainly had a small budget and outdated equipment and needed people who thought it mattered. He told her. She stopped shoveling for a moment. She looked at him with the look that didn't have a simple name. Yeah, she said quietly. That's where. The trial proceedings ran for 14 months, not one trial. 5 separate prosecutorial tracks, each with its own timeline and its own specific legal architecture, each moving through the federal system with the particular combination of deliberate slowness and occasional sudden acceleration that characterized how these things worked. Mason testified twice, once in the main conspiracy case and once in the murder charges related to his father's death, because those were 2 separate tracks with separate evidentiary standards. The second testimony was the harder one. He sat in a federal courtroom and said out loud, in the official language of legal proceedings with a stenographer recording it and a judge listening, that his father had been murdered. He said it without flinching and without looking at the defense table. He looked at the prosecutor across from him and answered every question directly, and when it was over, he walked out of the courthouse into a February afternoon exactly 1 year after the blizzard and stood on the steps for a while breathing cold air. Evelyn had been there. She wasn't visible from the witness stand. The seating arrangements in federal proceedings were not accommodating to informal support structures, but he knew she was in the room. When he came out, she was on the courthouse steps, which she'd been told she couldn't use while he was testifying due to the witness sequencing rules, but those rules had concluded with his exit, and she was there now in her coat, with her hands in her pockets. Okay, she said. Yeah, he said. He stood beside her on the steps. Yeah. They stood there for a minute in the cold. First one, she said. The first of the verdicts would come in 8 days. The main conspiracy case. 11 defendants, 14 months of proceedings, 412 exhibits of evidence, and a federal jury that had been in deliberation for 6 days. You think they'll convict, he said. I think we gave them everything, she said. That's not what I asked. She looked at him. Yes, she said. I think they'll convict. They did. All 11, on all primary counts. The verdicts came in on a Thursday afternoon, and Mason was in the kitchen making lunch when his phone rang with Evelyn's number, and she said, before he'd finished saying hello, all of them. He sat down at the kitchen table. All of them, he said. Every count. The judge is scheduling sentencing for April. Her voice was steady. She'd been steadier in the months since the blizzard than he'd expected, or maybe more steady than before. The kind of stability that comes not from having solved everything, but from having put down the specific thing that was making everything else harder to carry. The prosecutor is looking at 35 minimum. The executives are going to argue it down from what the prosecution wants, but the evidence is comprehensive enough that... Evelyn, he said. Yeah. That's enough for now. A pause. Yeah, she said. Okay. He heard her breathe. Just that. Just the sound of her breathing on a Thursday afternoon in her office in the city while he sat in his kitchen in his grandfather's house with his lunch getting cold, and the weight that had lived in his chest for 6 years finally, genuinely, shifted. Not gone. He wasn't built for the kind of optimism that would let him say gone, but lighter. The stone was still there, but it was smaller, or he was something other than the version of himself that had been defined by carrying it, and the difference between those two things was real, even if he couldn't fully articulate it. Come up this weekend, he said. Lily's been asking. Just Lily? Evelyn said. Her voice was neutral, but he knew her well enough by now. Again, or still, it was hard to separate the two, to hear the thing underneath neutral. No, he said. Not just Lily. The weekend she came up, it snowed again. Not a blizzard, just regular February snow, 1.5 inches, the ordinary kind that fell without incident and lay quietly on the ground and made the world softer at the edges. Lily decided they had to build a snowman, which they did, badly, in the backyard in the late afternoon light. The snowman had structural problems from the beginning, and by the time they'd gotten the second sphere onto the first, it was already leaning at an angle that suggested it had made some questionable decisions earlier in life. Lily found 2 sticks for arms, and Mason contributed a carrot he couldn't verify was still good, and Evelyn stood back and assessed the situation. It needs a hat, she said. We don't have an outdoor hat, Lily said. What about that old one in the mudroom? Evelyn said to Mason. He looked at her. She had learned the inventory of his mudroom was the thing. She had learned it the way you learn the layout of a place you've been spending time in, the quiet, accumulating knowledge of a person who pays attention. He'd been watching her do it for months and had not said anything about it because he didn't have words for it yet that weren't too large for the moment, but he'd noticed. He noticed everything she did, which was its own specific data point that he'd been filing carefully. The gray one, he said. She went and got it. It was an old wool cap that had belonged to his grandfather, that had lived in the mudroom for 30 years, that Mason kept meaning to do something with and never did. She put it on the snowman's leaning head. Lily stepped back and looked at the finished product with an artist's assessment of their creation. He's crooked, she said. Yeah, Mason said. He looks kind of sad. He's fine, Evelyn said. He's just had a difficult day. Lily looked at her. How do you know? Because he's still standing, Evelyn said. Lily considered this with great seriousness and then nodded as though this was a satisfactory explanation and went inside for hot chocolate. Mason stood in the backyard with Evelyn in the early February dark, looking at the crooked snowman in his grandfather's old hat. That was surprisingly profound for a snowman comment, he said. I was talking about the snowman, she said. Sure you were. She looked at him. The cold had put color in her face, and her breath made small clouds in the dark air, and she was looking at him in the way she sometimes looked at him now. Not the guarded thing from the early weeks, not the careful management of a situation, but something more open and less defended, the look of a person who has decided to stop protecting themselves quite so aggressively from the possibility of something good. He'd been waiting, in his own way, for that. He hadn't rushed it. He was not a man who rushed things, and they had both been through enough that rushing felt wrong, felt like it would cheapen something that had cost a lot. But he'd been watching it arrive, the way you watch a season change. Not one day, but over days, gradual and unmistakable. I've been thinking about something, she said. What? That question you said you never asked me, back then. The one you were afraid of the answer to. He looked at her. You asked me if it was real, she said. I told you yes, but that was the past tense version. I want to say, she stopped. She was not someone who was frequently uncertain in speech, and the uncertainty cost her something, and he let it cost her without rescuing her from it because he thought she needed to say this in her own time. I want to say the present tense version too, if that's… She stopped again. If that's something. The snow fell. The yard was quiet. In the kitchen window, Lily was visible at the counter, already negotiating with the hot chocolate supplies, her small figure moving with the purposeful inefficiency of a child who has been trusted to do something mostly alone. It's something, Mason said. She held his gaze. Okay, she said. He reached out and adjusted the old wool hat on the snowman's head, which had been sliding. The snowman held its angle, committed to its lean, shaped by the imperfections of its construction into something that was not what anyone had planned but was its own particular shape, occupying its own particular space in the yard. There's a thing that happens to people who have been through real loss. Not the theoretical kind, but the kind that takes something specific and irreplaceable and leaves the exact shape of its absence behind. They become, most of them, either harder or more careful. They build walls, or they build calluses, or they learn to hold the things they love at a slight distance, so that the next time something is taken, the reach is shorter and the fall is smaller. It's not cowardice, it's physics. You learn what falling costs and you start protecting the altitude. Mason Carter had done that. He'd done it consciously and he'd done it well. And it had worked in the sense that he'd kept functioning, kept working, kept being a father, kept maintaining the shape of a life, even when the inside of it had felt for years like a building where some of the load-bearing structures had been quietly removed. You could still walk through it. You just had to know where not to step. What had happened in the blizzard, not just the night itself but everything it had opened, had done something to those walls that he was still figuring out. It wasn't that they were gone. He wasn't 22 anymore, and some things that happen to you don't reverse, they just become part of the structure, part of what you're built from. But there was light getting through that hadn't been getting through before, and he'd decided somewhere in the 14 months of proceedings, and phone calls, and Lily asking Evelyn to do all the voices in bedtime stories, that he was going to stop fighting the light quite so hard. It was not a comfortable decision. It didn't come with guarantees. Evelyn Sterling was a complicated person with a complicated history and a life that was still being assembled from the wreckage of what she'd spent 8 years doing, and Mason Carter was a man with a broken nose and cracked ribs, and a daughter who needed him to be careful with himself, and neither of them was uncomplicated enough to make this simple. But simple was not the only thing worth doing. Sometimes the complicated thing was the true thing, and you did it anyway because the alternative was the particular small death of staying only with what was safe. He thought about Sarah. He thought about her the way he'd been learning to think about her in the past months. Not as an absence, not as the shape of a loss, but as a whole person who had existed completely, who had pulled a thread she wasn't supposed to pull because she couldn't leave a wrong thing alone, who had loved him in a specific and irreplaceable way that was its own complete thing and didn't need to be competed with or erased or relocated to make room for whatever this was going to be. She was not gone from this yard or from this house or from the person Mason was. She was in the way Lily tilted her head when she was thinking. She was in the library 2 counties over that now had a significant endowment from the Sterling Foundation, specifically for research resources and archival preservation. She was in the federal record that now listed her death as a homicide with identified perpetrators who were serving federal sentences. She was somewhere in the structure of everything Mason was still building, because people you lose that way don't leave the structure. They become part of it. He stood in the backyard in the February dark and knew all of this, the whole complicated shape of it, and he didn't try to simplify it or resolve it into something cleaner. He let it be the thing it was, real and specific and his. Lily's voice from inside the kitchen. "The hot chocolate is ready." Mason and Evelyn looked at each other. "She put ready in capital letters somehow," Evelyn said. "She has the gift," Mason said. They went inside. The kitchen was warm and overlit, and Lily had made something in the mugs that involved approximately twice the recommended amount of cocoa powder and was vibrating slightly with the pride of it. The snowman was outside in the yard, leaning in its committed way against the winter. The house was the same house it had always been. 90 years of weather in its walls, 3 generations of people moving through its rooms, the particular persistence of a structure that has outlasted most of what has tried to end it. Mason took his mug. Evelyn took hers. Lily watched them both drink with the focused attention of someone awaiting a verdict. "It's good, Bug," Mason said. Lily turned to Evelyn. "It's very strong," Evelyn said, "which is exactly what we needed." Lily beamed. Outside, the snow kept falling in its quiet, ordinary way, covering the yard and the road and the fields beyond in the same patient white it had always used. Indifferent to the fact that the people inside the house were different now than they'd been a year ago, that something had broken open in the storm and had been slowly, imperfectly, and without any guarantee of outcome put back together in a new shape. That was the thing about storms. They didn't care what they changed. They came and did what they did and moved on, and what was left behind was just what remained. Damaged in places, still standing in others, and sometimes, if you were paying attention, stronger in the cracks than it had ever been in the smooth parts. Mason Carter stood in his kitchen with his daughter, and a woman who had walked into his life twice now through terrible weather, and he drank the too strong hot chocolate, and he let the warmth of it work its way down, and he decided that was enough for today. Tomorrow was its own problem. Today, this was enough.